When you think of the kings of Nickelodeon's programming throughout the years, your mind likely goes to SpongeBob, The Fairly Odd Parents, Rocko's Modern Life, Danny Phantom, Cat Dog, Invader Zim, the list goes on. But among the greats, there are several that didn't make the Hall of Fame. Those shows that might have made an impact on you as a child, but their life was cut short by any number of factors. Tak and the Power of Juju is one of those cases, but interestingly, it also isn't. The concept that would eventually become Tak started being worked on around 1995 by the CEO of Avalanche Entertainment, John Blackburn. Tak and his world had been on the back burner for Avalanche's team for a few years. After a number of projects had come and gone, a group of concept artists created some designs for a game they had all been stewing over for years. A real water cooler conversation that quickly grew into a game concept where the main pitch was that you'd be in control of a witch doctor. They just so happened to have the chance to pitch this game to THQ, and seeing as how THQ held exclusive licensing rights for several entertainment companies, including Nickelodeon, Tak was put in front of the suits for both companies. And he made a pretty good first impression. The team were given several notes for refinement, but after a few more meetings, Tak was selected as the face of the project moving forward. Now, my history with Tak is pretty similar to what I would assume anyone else's history with Tak is. One day when I was young, I wandered into GameStop with my big brother and grandma and yelled, "I want this one!" And therefore it was mine. The Gamecube version of Tak and the Power of Juju was one of the many games that I would watch my big brother play any chance I got. This was one of the ones that I was always jealous of the fact that I didn't get to play as much as he did. It just looked like so much fun, but oh well. After we had had our time with it, and a few years later, we were surprised when we came across Tak and the Great Juju Challenge in a very similar fashion to the first one. Its main draw was that it was an entirely co-op experience, which was something that I was all in for around the time, mainly because I was past my phase of drooling on an upside-down controller thinking I was playing the game alongside my brother. That's a single player game, you stupid kid, come on.
Hey, come on man, it's a condition.
But after that, the only time I remember seeing Tak's Descended Belly was that one time he got his own TV show on Nickelodeon in 2007. But that was the last I remember of him. So I figured it would be fun to go back and see the pieces of this puzzle that I had missed. How many games could I have really missed out on from this franchise? Let's see, there's the original, that'll be a nice stroll down memory lane for sure. It had a Game Boy Advanced version, okay, I can go through with that. I gotta make this thing complete if I'm gonna call this video a complete retrospective. There's the second game, understandable. It's got a GBA port, okay. The third game I remember being pretty boring, that should be fun. Yep, the Game Boy version and a DS version, okay, interesting. Then we come to an interesting breach in reality. The games that I just rattled off could be classified as the first era of Tak. When the TV show dropped in 2007, this began a new continuity, for lack of a better term. We'll of course go over it in more detail when we get to it, but it's definitely an interesting left turn for the franchise. And then to go along with what we'll be referring to as the modern era of Tak, we have Tak and the Guardians of Gross for the Nintendo Wii, and I guess we'll be closing our time together today with Tak Mojo Mistake on the Nintendo DS. As you can clearly see, I have my work cut out for me, but I'm ready to get this thing started. This is going to be some kind of journey, but I can only hope it's one that you all enjoy. By all means, use the chapter selection in the description to zip around to the sections you're specifically interested in, or watch the video in one chunk to see the entire story of this hit Nickelodeon franchise that was dead on arrival more than one time. Welcome to my complete examination of the Tak and the Power of Juju franchise.
Tak and the Power of Juju, the video game, coming fall 2003. This game is not yet rated.
Tak and the Power of Juju opens up with the player being directly addressed by the character Jabulba. He sets the stage by telling us of a great tragedy that has befallen the Pupanunu people. The night before, the evil shaman Tlaloc was passed over to be the Grand Shaman by the council, and as an act of revenge, he stole the village's moonstones, these stones that give the village's guardian, the Moon Juju, her great power, as well as turning the villagers themselves into sheep. This was all foretold in the Pupanunu people's prophecy. However, it was also foretold that a mighty warrior trained by the village's high shaman would rise up and turn the Pupanunu people back to normal, as well as defeat Tlaloc and restore the Moon Juju's power. But there's just one problem.
Tak! What are you doing?
You told me to go get Locke.
Yes, that's right. Go fetch Locke. Stop playing with the sheep.
I did get Locke.
No, you fetched a dirty, stinky animal.
That's Locke.
So with the mighty warrior Locke out of commission, it's up to Jabulba's assistant Tak to save the day. And first is to basically find a few different items that assist Jabulba in changing Locke back to normal, but then he immediately goes and gets himself trampled by the
Poopa-noo-noo.
the sheep people, effectively dying. So Tak then ventures off to the spirit world to reclaim Locke's soul, and after being returned to life, he quickly leaves the scene because he's too busy shitting himself, and no, I'm not kidding.
Oh my, oh my, oh my.
Tak!
So once again, Tak just goes ahead and recovers the 3 moonstones while Locke is busy, restoring the Moon Juju and her power. As everyone prepares for the final battle, the Moon Juju reveals to the shock of no one that Tak is actually the great warrior from the legend. He's completed all the prophecy's requirements while Locke has done nothing but stay on the sidelines. So with some newfound confidence, Tak takes the fight to Locke and wins, with the credits rolling right after that. As a story for a children's game, I think this works rather well. I've always liked the way that the player is engaged in the story at the very beginning too. Jabulba makes mention to the player's controller or magic stick and the TV too. He refers to them as powerful Juju and asks them to help Tak on his journey. I could see a kid watching that for the first time and just having a field day. It never gets another mention beyond that, unfortunately, but it probably would have gotten annoying if it had had any more focus. So I think this works best as a fun initial connection. Because it's not like the story is very involved by any stretch of the imagination. I'd be willing to actually say that the story is pretty shallow. It literally revolves around 4 or 5 scavenger hunts to accomplish very small tasks, and after you turn the last one in, the story is at its conclusion. There are only a handful of characters in the game, and a lot of them are only around to say a handful of lines before leaving for good. Tak, Jabulba, and Flora are focused on the most, but that's because one is the main character, one is the main character's guide, and the other is the main character's mentor. Tak is the straight man to most of the game's crazy over-the-top characters. He's your typical lovable goofball that doesn't come across as a chatterbox, but also isn't a mute.
Cough drop?
Jabulba is the wise shaman, who's very knowledgeable, but also the old quirky one. Flora is a Juju and a friend of the Moon Spirit. She essentially fills the role of a guide character, a Navi or a Takal if you will. She constantly chimes in to tell the player what they need to be doing or how to do certain tasks that might be confusing for younger players. And at the beginning of the game, she literally flies around the hub world to make sure you know exactly where you're going. Now, no matter what I say about the substance that these characters bring to the table, they all have very fun exchanges with Tak.
Okay, but I don't care about any meat. I actually need to find a way through the... Oh, hey! Whoa! Knock it off! Hands off the loincloth!
Insolent, yummy, fresh meat!
There are always lots of quippy jokes and tons of physical humor that still made me laugh today. I'm not kidding. But even so, I would be hard-pressed to call any of the other characters you come across supporting. The only thing they really feel like they're there to support is the joke quota. Locke is your typical overly confident alpha bro. Once he's brought back to life, he really doesn't do anything. He asks Tak to itch his butt when they're in the spirit world, but that is literally the only time the two interact throughout the whole game. There are also several Jujus who Tak will run into that can help him in various ways. You got Death Juju here that's voiced by Rob Paulson, and I gotta say, he's probably one of my favorites in the series, and you'll see why as we go on. There's Caged Juju, who lives in a cage and will help Tak by giving him certain things along the adventure. Then there's Dinky Juju, who doesn't like to be called small because she's really small, I guess. They're all really fun to talk to, but they're quite literally keys disguised as punchlines. The only exception to this is the Moon Juju, but she only has one dedicated cutscene at the very end, and it's to tell Tak that he's the mighty warrior. Each one of these Juju will do something for Tak after they have a funny conversation, something like changing the world in some way, or most often they'll simply open up new areas to explore. Again, I really like the dialogue that each of them have, but it contributes nothing to the plot. It fills out the world a little bit more by showing us that Juju come in all sorts of flavors, shapes, and sizes with different personalities to boot, but none of them have anything to say about our current mission, and that can't help but make them all feel slightly inconsequential as a result. Again, keys disguised as punchlines. Locke, the titular villain that kicks off the entire game, Tak meets him a grand total of 2 times. He has run-ins with pins and needles, Locke's henchmen, more than he interacts with the man himself. The two never really have a dialogue. You kinda just have to take the game's word when it comes to him being evil. The opening cutscene tells us that Locke has much more nefarious plans after he does something with the Moonstones, but we never get to see or know anything about those plans. And yes, before I get the comment, I am aware that this is a children's game, but even when I was a kid, it was a little difficult to see eye to eye with Tak because I never understood why he was doing all these things other than because I'm moving him to the objectives. And that is the reason, but I don't think it's a great one. So the story might be a little lacking, but how does all that fetching and collecting translate into being a video game? Pretty enjoyable, actually. John Blackburn has gone on record saying that Tak took heavy inspiration from the 3 platforming champions of the PlayStation. He makes mention to Sly Cooper's fluid controls, Jak and Daxter's expansive and dense level design, and Ratchet & Clank's witty, humorous writing. And after completing this one for the first time in a long time, I can see these traits were properly manifested in Tak. The game is broken up into essentially 4 scavenger hunts spanning several locations across the game's world. Once each of the required items have been collected, you're told to return to Jabulba. Then a cutscene will play denoting what the items you collected did to progress the story, then a new collectible will be presented. Progressing through the game is very seamless. Each area has a sort of intended order that you'll tackle them in, and when you find all the items you need for your current phase, it's usually conveniently at the end of those areas. It even has the common courtesy to warp you back to somewhere you need to go once you finish a task to not waste your time. I wholeheartedly love that kind of stuff. But it also won't be uncommon for Flora to nudge you in the direction of a new area you haven't visited yet that just so happens to hold the next sequence of areas you need to explore. But notice how I say Flora will only nudge you. Tak is actually a pretty open game once you get past the first 2 phases or so. In order to unlock the path for a few areas, you'll need to find a specific Tiki relic somewhere in the previous area. But some of these tikis aren't behind any specific roadblock. If you just so happen to be exploring an area for one set of items, it's absolutely possible to find a tiki and use it to unlock an area you don't necessarily have to explore just yet. Now, don't get too excited, Metroid fans. A lot of these feel like going out of your way to get a new ability or tool. It never gets as crazy as a sequence break or skipping phases of collectibles here. But some out-of-the-order possibilities are a very welcome addition. The areas themselves are actually pretty fun to traverse too. None are that difficult to simply get from one end to the other. There are a few tight jumps, some climbing ropes, a zipline or two, but the actual challenge comes from the puzzles each area asks you to solve. There is the occasional outlier puzzle that does its own thing, like how the burial grounds asks you to escort 4 mummies across dangerous obstacle courses. Tak has to keep himself from getting hurt, but oftentimes has to use the mummies to solve puzzles or as makeshift shields from the dangers of the dungeon. But under the hood, the majority of these puzzles are created from the machinery that are the animals of this game. Each of these animals have a few different behaviors that they're beholden to and will strictly follow. Rams are aggressive creatures, ready to charge at Tak as soon as he enters their territory, but similar to all the other animals in the game, they love melons, and can be distracted and tricked into interacting with other elements when tempted by one. There are monkeys that stay on top of the trees. They're passive little guys by nature, but if provoked, they'll throw a coconut at the closest creature. Sheep don't really do anything but walk around, but they make for a good treadmill stand-in if they're picked up and thrown onto one. Give them a good smack and they keep the switches tied to these treadmills active. Rhinos are ridden and great for clearing out those wooden gates. Ostriches are ridden as well, but they're much faster, have a long jump, and are a little unruly. They're one of the more underused animals in the game, but they come in handy when they're there. We have ourselves some chickens. They don't do anything throughout most of the game, they just walk around and cluck, save for one occasion, but we'll talk about that later on. And finally, there are orangutans. These dudes are always hanging out next to these trees and snacking on bananas. To get to the tasty bananas, they have to pull these trees down a bit. If Tak stands on the big leaf that touches the ground, it'll... Orangutans also apparently hate sheep because if a sheep gets even relatively close to them, they stop whatever they're doing and grab them so they can launch them far away. From here, several fun interactions are propped up by these animals' behaviors and skill sets. One particular example would be something like provoking a monkey to attack an orangutan, which causes the orangutan to fling the monkey to a different tree, where the closest thing to it is now a sheep on a treadmill that Tak needed to activate from a distance. Stuff like that is very fun to learn piece by piece and then put all that knowledge together and use it. The first few phases of the game are more reliant on the animals to prop up the puzzles, with the challenge coming from you understanding how each of them work to solve these little brain teasers. But in the late game areas, the difficulty gets cranked up a notch, and you're asked to not only be familiar with the mechanics, but also quite competent with them. Straight from the recesses of my childhood memories look alive, it's the Chicken Temple, where the puzzles require you to find a way to get these golden eggs back to the elevator in the middle so you can make it to the top of the temple. The only snag with that being that the chickens don't like that, so anytime you pick up one of these eggs, they immediately aggro Tak and attempt to knock it out of his hand. It was probably the most frustrating set of puzzles in the game for how unpredictable the chickens are as puzzle elements. There are several instances where the chickens have to be smacked and knocked out to hold down pressure plates. For the first few eggs, this isn't a big deal. They're really just about outmaneuvering the chickens when you have the egg. But the last few become much more elaborate, with the inclusion of exploding chicken eggs and pressure plates to access those. Then all of these elements get mixed up with time limits limits and limited access to both types of eggs and chickens that are trying to attack Tak on top of the patrolling chicken warriors that will smack you if they see you. It was just a very tedious section filled with way more back and forth than I would have cared for. And then there's Dry Rock Cavern. You have to platform across these very small and narrow stalagmites while dodging enemies and trying to collect items too. It's not all bad, but it is a decent challenge. And some of these platforms have slippery surfaces, so it can be difficult to make jumps. It's made a lot easier when at full health, however, seeing as how by this point, Tak should have the Warrior's Amulet, which increases speed, strength, and jump height when at full health. And for some reason, this effect ignores those slippery floors. And why don't we use that as a segue into the things you can do with Tak? Because that's not the only wonky thing to get used to when controlling this kid. When you get down to it, Tak is a very interesting platformer character to control. He has two different weapons that give him access to two different skill sets depending on which one he has in his hands. When the Spirit Rattle is out, Tak can perform a jump and then a sort of corrective double jump. And then by pressing the right trigger, he can swap to his Warrior's Staff, which allows him to do a long pole vault jump. The only other real advantage the staff has over the Rattle is the Acorn Blowgun. This allows you to activate switches or take care of threats from a distance. You do have the means of physically attacking with both weapons, but it's literally just flailing either weapon and praying you hit the enemy before they hit you. Combat isn't really combat in this game. Hell, keeping track of your health isn't even intuitive. The feather on Tak's head is his health meter. This is neat, but it's also a little less than ideal. The most engagement you're gonna get with combat is trying to juggle an enemy's dead body by timing hits as they flip around in the air. The staff having the vault jump and the blowgun are good moves, but the Spirit Rattle takes the cake in one major way: Juju spells. Okay, well, I don't want to get your hopes up too much, but they are kinda neat to have. About halfway through the game, Tak will unlock the ability to find Juju spells strewn about the world. These range from things like a basic healing spell, throwing projectiles out to attack nearby enemies, and literally turning enemies into chickens. One that I found particularly helpful against the larger enemies is this Thunderstrike spell. The best thing it does for me is it's a one-hit kill on these bigger types of enemies. And I mean, I can't lie to you and say I didn't use it a whole lot when I was under time limits in the later areas. Like, I tried to use the Spirit Strike spell on a boss out of curiosity, but it did nothing. Thus, I can safely say that these spells don't add any particular amount of depth to the combat, but they do give you some options, which isn't a bad thing. And that's when the Juju magic's most frustrating aspect comes into play, and that's how limited you are in your use of magic. All of the spells that Tak has access to cost mana. Restoration costs 75 mana, Thunderstrike costs 50 mana, and so on and so forth. It doesn't sound that bad, I know, but if you start relying on these spells and using them like you might want to, you'll quickly find yourself running low due to how much mana is required by regular use of the spells. You see, mana is gathered by collecting mana feathers. You can actually start collecting mana as early as the tutorial, but you only gain access to Juju magic around the halfway mark, meaning you should have saved up a nice little triple-digit pool of mana by this point. This almost feels deliberately designed this way though, because the later phases of Tak throw more aggressive enemies at you far more frequently, with health drop feathers becoming coincidentally less frequent, forcing you to rely on your restoration dance magic a lot more, but that 75 mana per use starts chipping away at your number a lot faster than you built it up. And that's on top of any offensive spells you might want to use to make the game easier for yourself. I just can't help but feel like this system deserved a little more balance. Towards the end of the game, magic actually becomes a great asset in making everything a bit more comfortable, and the spells are also just a fun break from tapping the B button to take care of every problem. But if you're like me and get excited by these new spells and want to try them out, just to have that bite you in the ass by burning into your small mana pool and leave you with no healing for some of the more difficult segments towards the end of the game. Ultimately, it's not a big deal because of how easy this game is, but it can be a little disheartening. And yeah, this game is pretty easy. You only fight 3 or 4 types of enemies in the game, and they're all variations on the Nurble. Some fly, some are big, but they all get smacked in the face in the same way, leading to an eventual explosion. The bosses either range from brainless walking 2 steps left and right to wait for an opening, super frustrating difficulty spike that boggles the mind, or one of Pins and Needles' 3 quirky boss battles. Seriously, they make you grow their heads until they explode, then there's a literal dance battle. You play Ostrich Mario Kart with them, and then you launch explosive eggs at them. The only traditional fights are with the plant monsters, and I guess you could call Tlaylock's final boss fight traditional, but even that one's just running around and killing plants. It feels decidedly rushed as an ending, actually. But all of the scavenger hunts are for all intents and purposes the real meat of the game, even if they're really easy too. Oh, that reminds me. So Tak reviewed good to average scores with a lot of criticism coming from the collectible that you're told to collect around phase 2, the Yorbles. I even got in on this criticism too. In 2019, I made a video with a segment explaining how this game is ruined by the hunt for 100 of these things. I have now come to the realization that this is not the end of the world, however. In fact, not only did I overreact in that video, but I think every journalist who criticized this aspect did too. Is it slightly bloated? Maybe. But Avalanche had the best countermeasure for this response. Only problem is, they didn't tell anyone it was in the game. I only discovered in this playthrough that you can bring up a menu with item tallies and objective checklists for literally every area in the game. This thing tells you when you still have Yorbles left to find in certain areas, as well as when there are other things to do. Also, there are only 100 Yorbles to find. That is the minimum amount you have to get to progress that phase of the narrative. There are 200 Yorbles in the game, so you literally only have to find half of them. And that objective list makes it so easy, and beyond that, like I mentioned earlier, just progressing through the game will likely bring you in front of everything you need to find. It's a very well-paced game that can't help but feel a little rushed towards the end. And there are so many one-off ideas or mechanics that don't really fit anywhere in the video, so let's talk about them now. This chicken suit is pretty cool. You can fly around with the help of the air vents and drop explosive eggs while gliding. You can even make chain explosions if you want to. Despite it being a back-of-the-box feature though, you only use it for about 45 minutes out of the 8 hours you play, and then you never find it again. The spirit world was a really neat section where you had to switch between things that were in and out of the realm of the living. You could find really weird cool stuff like spirits that turned you into nurbles. And then there were the snow and sandboarding minigames. These were a lot of fun, but the Numa Dunes track is the only one with collectibles that actually matter in it, so unless you just didn't feel like popping in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, you could just spend some time shredding in these admittedly fun minigames. I really like Tak and the Power of Juju overall. It's not trying to be anything super ambitious, and it also can't help but feel like it didn't get the time it needed to do everything it wanted to do. But it does the basics well. Platforming is weighty and fun to master, combat is bare as you can get, but functional. Visually, I think the game does a good job of balancing fantastic character animation with colorful environments. I've read in interviews that this engine was specifically designed for the PS2's architecture, and I've been playing on the Gamecube, and if you couldn't tell, I've experienced plenty of my fair share of slowdown. This 2D section in particular got the worst of it, and even some cutscenes had dips, oddly enough. But I still think the particle effects and lighting do a good job of displaying the 6th generation of consoles' capabilities. And guys, this soundtrack f***ing slaps. Save for an electric guitar here and a marimba there, it features almost exclusively woodwind instruments and some really great percussion. Most of the area's themes begin with only the wind instruments fluttering in and welcoming you to these locations with a scene of mystery, and then after a while they introduce these heavy sounding drums. They also really love to add dissonance to these tracks, which really gives it some forward motion. Give me contrasting tempos and I will never not bop my head to stuff like this. Some of them can tend to blend in from time to time, but the more laid back area themes are great too. Then we get to the plant boss theme, and this is where it turns into something I'd like to coin as jungle grunge. I don't know if this completely fits this game, but I love it. And the same can be said for the road trip theme song that plays in Numa Dunes. Then you have the track that plays when you're having a dance battle with pins and needles. It's appropriate, but it also feels like you slipped into an alternate, much funkier dimension. I truly can't recommend this OST enough. I'll even leave you a card up top to a playlist, but really quick, before we shift gears to the second game in the series, let's take a look at the Game Boy Advance version of Tak and the Power of Juju to see if this handheld version can be somewhat of a hidden gem in its own right. No. This is one of those that I think the footage really speaks for itself, but for the sake of being thorough, I'll give you the Sparks Notes version. We have a linear, level-to-level platforming collectathon game on our hands here. You run through each level of each world trying to make it to the end. There are sheep to collect, but they don't do anything at all if you manage to collect them, so why would you? Yorbles make a return, but instead of being mandatory, they just give you an extra life if you can collect 50 of them. And the only animals to interact with are the rhinos that might as well be cutscenes for how little input they require from the player, and rams that just have to be shot with the blowgun before they run forward and clear your path. As you could imagine, this game follows the story of its console counterpart, but while missing several little moments. Every extra Juju has been cut except for the encounters with Death Juju in the spirit world. The minigames are also gone, so no snowboarding or sandboarding, but for some godforsaken reason we had to keep the 3 boss battles with pins and needles that come at the very end of the game. The stupid dance battle is back, and if you don't make the first move within, no joke, 2 seconds of them finishing, you lose the round. It was so awful, and while that was thought to be a worthy inclusion, the entirety of Mountaintop is nowhere to be seen, which sucks because I loved Mountaintop. Ugh, whatever. As far as moveset goes, Tak starts off with the bow staff this time, but he can't swing it or use it to jump higher than he normally can. Instead, to attack enemies in the first few levels, you have to irritate beehives to attack the closest thing to them. Then after a while, he'll gain access to an actual melee weapon with the spirit rattle. Then there's the chicken suit, which controls like a more awkward version of Flappy Bird. Tak can also straight up transform into a fish after touching one of these shrines. He can swim better than normal and has an attack that doesn't work. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump in. I didn't like this game. For starters, the camera. Probably the worst camera I've ever had to deal with in a 2D game. It constantly jitters up and down and all around, never knowing what it wants to show you. And 9 times out of 10, it fails at showing you anything. The amount of leaps of faith I had to make in this game was staggering. You would have thought I was playing Speedy Gonzales again. It's not even with big drop-offs either. Small ones like this right here, it's a small drop-off, and when I step off, surprise, surprise, it's a pool of lava. Tak's sprite is also just too big, I think, or at least his hitbox is. I counted a few times where I could have sworn the edge of his pixel was grazed and I took damage. And I was ready to break something in this underwater level with the currents that zoom you everywhere and the reefs on the sides will hurt Tak if he touches them. The game has a fetish for zooming him right into that shit. Enemy placement in general can be dickish. The leaps of faith can lead you to landing on an enemy. These birds that come out of nowhere are about as cheap as you can get. I guess the nurbles aren't anything horrible this time around. I did feel my soul leave my body when one of them started to spin dash at me. The shaman nurbles that shoot projectiles that follow Tak around were tough at first, but got a little easier to deal with when I learned to use the level to my advantage. When playing this game casually, like straight level to level is the only goal, I think it's passable. Except for the water level and the pins and needles dance off, those were just not fun, but it's when you try to go after those extra sheep when it becomes a chore. The serious lack of invincibility frames for Tak leads him to getting tossed around like a ragdoll, and even combo crushed by moving blocks like I somehow managed here. And in the beginning, Tak only has a few hits. Golden feathers will give Tak an additional hit point, but I still managed to drain all of these feathers in the later levels. Visually, it's alright. I can't help but wonder if all the characters have been put in a deep fryer though. Seriously, I know the GBA had limitations, but this seems like something that could have used more time in the oven. I know other GBA games, other licensed GBA games that have more frames of animation for the main character and a more vivid color palette. And that's the vibe I get from the rest of the game as well. It just feels like a game that was made with a deadline breathing down its back from Jump Street. If you have to play this one at all, play it like a normal platformer where you're just trying to make it from one end of the level to the next. It's a mediocre portable platformer on its own, and when you put it up against the console game, there's just a lot that doesn't compare. I would have hit my parents if they bought me this game. But only 1 year later in 2004, Avalanche and Nick Games put out a direct sequel titled Tak 2 and the Staff of Dreams. No, stop autocorrecting to cream. Staff of Cream sounds disgusting. Anyway, picking up an undetermined amount of time after the first game, Tak has been finding himself falling asleep for long periods of time. And I'm not talking a few hours, no, he's been asleep for 16 days. Jabulba and Locke have been trying to wake him up with no success, but on the other side, Tak has found his way into the dream realm.
Dream, dream, dream.
He's told by this dream Juju that there's a princess in need of rescuing. She's being held captive by the Guardian of Dreams, and to defeat this Guardian, Tak will need to take its Staff of Dreams. He's initially disinterested by the notion of rescuing a princess, but eventually steps up to the challenge when Dream Juju claims he'll be stuck here forever if he doesn't. So after waking up and filling the other two in on the situation, the Pupanunu warrior sets off to find them. And he has no idea where to start looking, so Jabulba suggests that they visit his brother JB for guidance. After rescuing him at his planetarium, JB claims that he has heard of the Dream Juju before. He surmises that putting Tak back into the dream world would be a good place to start. So he does.
Sleep now!
While in the dream world, Tak defeats the Dream Guardian and takes the Staff of Dreams for himself. The princess then shows up and turns out to be pins and needles in disguise, and the dream Juju that's been guiding him to do all these tasks is none other than Tlaloc. Still in sheep form, I guess he survived that extremely suggestive situation that we left him in the first game's ending. The three struggle over the staff, which leads to it being snapped in two. This opens a rift in the dream world, allowing Pins, Needles, and Tlaloc to escape into reality along with the nightmare creatures. In the squabble to get it back, Tak is knocked unconscious and wakes up in the presence of the Moon Juju, who grants him new power to defeat Tlaloc. After chasing the voodoo dolls around the multiverse, Tak finally catches up to them and gets the staff back. Unfortunately, Locke unknowingly hands the staff to Tlaloc. After a battle with an army of evil sheep that don't do anything because they are sheep, Tak finishes the job by killing Tlaloc, literally. Everyone is celebrating the murder of this man just before Tak is pulled into a dream rift by an arm. Apparently, killing Tlaloc in the real world turned him into a nightmare creature in the dream world. The two both take the form of the Dream Guardian and duke it out with Tak again being the victor. The Dream Guardian appears and asks for his staff back, using it to send Tak home at last. The party congratulates Tak on a job well done as the credits begin to roll. But, uh-oh, those credits aren't real credits! So Tlaloc shows up again like a Team Rocket joke that doesn't know when to stop, conceding that he can't defeat Tak, so instead, he plans on killing his friends to eliminate his will to fight. But of course, Tak actually wins, sending Tlaloc to his doom one final time. The game then straight up pulls a Wizard of Oz, with Tak waking up at the beginning of the game, having Locke and Jabulba standing over him. They go off to do whatever, while one of Tlaloc's sheep watches them depart. Now, with the summary being slightly longer, you might think that equates to a deeper narrative or a more entertaining story, but that's not the case here, really. It's once again a completely passable story, but it's virtually the same concept as before. With both of these games, each story could essentially be its own 11-minute episode of a cartoon, maybe a 24-minute special if we're generous. But what I'm saying is nothing really happens in these games. There's plenty of flavor text and interactions with familiar and new Juju, but the major story moments are more or less things we've seen before. Tak battling both Pins and Needles in multiple areas was done in the first game, and around the halfway point again, I might add. And I would say that battling Tlaloc at the very end was out of nowhere, but they don't even try to pretend it's not him. The Dream Juju also just sounds like Tlaloc.
I'm probably gonna wake up any minute.
No, Tak.
And he's also on the front of the box, so yeah. There are some new things like meeting up with a wise old sage character like JB, which was probably one of the funnier moments I would say the game had, because Jabulba's younger brother wasn't wanted. Their parents never actually named him, so JB literally stands for Jabulba's brother.
JB, and you're Jabulba's brother. It's his same initials.
That's not funny. That is my name, Jabulba's brother. Mother didn't even bother to think of a name for me.
It made me laugh, I'll give it that. Now, thanks to a developer diary on IGN by project manager Troy Levitt, we actually have a bit of insight on how this project came together so quickly. In one of the first meetings that was to outline the focus of this upcoming project, John Blackburn highlighted the things that made the first game so successful. Before anything else, he brings up the quirky humor of Tak 1, and how it will be a major focus moving forward, and yeah, the comedy has definitely been cranked up. The first thing I noticed was that the player is no longer hinted at being an active participant in the story. They're no longer a strange Juju that guides Tak. To be fair, the concept didn't really go beyond that one-off introduction cutscene in the first game, but I thought it was cute, and it's a shame it was dropped. The whole narrative is now framed as a much more traditional Saturday morning cartoon, with jokes being very abundant and kinda overstaying their welcome in a few instances. Not to say that there weren't plenty that made me laugh, there were. I got a kick out of Locke being jealous of Tak taking his role as the tribe's warrior, even attempting to literally choke the life out of him, even if I do think Locke is one of the main sources of when these jokes become a bit long-winded. I'm upset that Flora isn't Tak's guide anymore, but when she does show up, she bounces off this new Juju Fauna. God, I just miss her. Guys, I think I've developed feelings for Flora over the course of these two games. Why couldn't she be my guide again? Apparently Nickelodeon is the one that ruined this for us by requesting that Jabulba be fleshed out as a character more. And whatever psycho was making calls at the time literally requests that he be turned into a flea. So he turns himself into a literal flea and accompanies us throughout the game. The jokes land initially, but you just start to feel the writers throwing jokes back and forth at each other and never really knowing when to put the pen down and stop. It hammers in the serialized cartoon show feel of it all a little too much. The second focus that John outlined was the notion of parodying what it means to be a hero in a video game. But one, I feel like I've kind of shown this to you with how Tak didn't care for rescuing the princess at first and all that jazz, and two, I don't think they had a great way to turn this idea into a compelling story. There are mentions about how the team struggled with this after sort of revealing their hand after the first game. After Tak is revealed to be the legendary warrior of the Pupanunu people's prophecy, he kinda is just the hero of this video game now. Not that it was ever really a point of contention for his character, but now he's extra confident. In the first game, he was hesitant or cautious, but never not confident. But here, he's always ready to jump into dangerous situations and take on powerful foes, which are good attributes for a hero to have, no doubt, but were no longer a deconstruction at this point. And interestingly, I think this extends to the game itself as well. So we have quite a few changes to go over moving from the first game to the sequel, but before we start with any of that, I want to complain. After I finished recording my playthrough for this game, I got to work writing this section of the script. My PC was in the shop at this time, so I had to use my old slow laptop. This thing had viruses and slowdown galore, so I finally had just had enough and gave it a factory reset. It loaded back up, ran a little faster, and everything was cool. I continued writing, but I needed to review some footage to fact check myself, and that's when it hit me. I didn't transfer the playthrough to my external drive before I reset it, so that entire 8 hours went down the drain. Meaning I've played through this game twice now and have had an unintentionally long period of time to settle on my thoughts. And if I seem like I'm exaggerating any difficult sections, then it was because I had a bitchin' time on my first playthrough, but remember the little tricks to breeze by them on my second. Doesn't mean those sections didn't suck though, you'll see it in a second. Let's begin with how everything is structured this time around, because it really surprised me when I began playing. Instead of an open hub area that branches off to several areas which have items and events that can open up new locations and possibly new events in old areas, progression is entirely linear here. Yeah, it's wild. Tak 2 progresses level by level, but there isn't really a level select or something like that. It's more natural. Think of it as a cinematic platformer where transitions from area to area are explained narratively, whether that be via a short minigame or a plain old cutscene. Tak and company using a canoe to escape enemies or a Crash Bandicoot-inspired chase sequence. I actually got major Crash Twinsanity vibes throughout this playthrough. I wouldn't even call this linear progression a bad thing, but I won't lie and say I miss exploring the more open-ended levels. But backing this new structure up are shakeups to the major components of Tak. For instance, animals. Interestingly, none of the original animals return, and that's not a coincidence. That was another mandatory change from John. Bears will be drawn to honey trees and lay down underneath to eat the honey. Tak can then use their bellies like a trampoline, but if he jumps on them too many times, they grab him and throw him a great distance. I see the bears as replacements for the orangutans. Bees can chase Tak and distract a few animals like frogs, which are just there to eat the bee swarms that you need to get from one part of the level to another. Skunks are only seen a good 2 or 3 times at the beginning of the game, but make Tak smelly if they're smacked. When smelly, Tak will scare away bears or attract boars. Boars are very territorial. If Tak approaches their space, they'll attack him and knock him away. But if he's smelly, he can ride them, busting through gates he otherwise couldn't. Boars basically combine rams and rhinos into one. And then there are the flying squirrels. The flying part doesn't come into play just yet, but they basically replace monkeys. For now, they just throw acorns at whatever is closest. The animals themselves are fine as gameplay elements. As I explained, they're all extremely similar to the previous animals, but instead, they're no longer elements that have to be taken into consideration when examining the level layout and current situation. Now, the animals feel much more like context-sensitive keys. Since progress is linear, there will never be any mystery behind what these things might do for you later. Every idea is laid out before you, and animals interacting and having complex act-react relationships are thrown out the window within the first hour or so. The first puzzle sees you scaring a bear up a hill to have him interact with a tree so you can use him to get across to the other side. To do this, you first have to go to the skunk and get him to make you smelly. You then walk the bear up this path to the tree. Then you have to use Fleejabulba to put this squirrel to sleep, but other than that, there was no detective work needed. You're just exercising your knowledge. Each puzzle is given to you in the order it needs to be interacted with. Shortly after, there's an area with a bear and a tree a short ways away from a mud pit with boars and skunks around. I assumed I had to avoid the boars while finding the right moment for the skunk to spray me and then scare the bear over to the tree he needed to be at, but my efforts didn't work out because the smelly state curiously shorted out before I could get there. Because what I actually had to do was ignore that, because there was a nice linear path that led up to a smelly flower and a boar that was able to sling me back up to the bear. Now, to be fair, this isn't the end of the world. It actually makes a lot of sense. The games are increasingly for children, so some streamlining is to be expected, but this just comes across as level design that was on a bit more of a tight deadline than the first game. with interestingly set up puzzles taking a backseat while not being able to say goodbye to the animals as gameplay elements. And speaking of, so we kept the phases of the game like previously, and after this section of the game, utilizing the animals together all but leaves the core gameplay loop only to be replaced with something else. But in the last phase, Tak is able to transform into these animals and utilize their abilities firsthand. And I'm just saying, the shitty GBA game kinda did that first. Well, actually, the Tlaloc fight in the last game did see you getting turned into animals a few times, so there is that. But anyway, the bear and the boar pretty much do the same stuff you could do when you were manipulating them, but now the frog and the squirrel have a bit more to do. The frog is able to swim very quickly, allowing for safe traversal in alligator-infested waters. It can also make use of its tongue to grapple between dragonflies. Don't get too excited though, it doesn't feel great to do. Instead of trying to implement some sort of fun physics-based swing like Tak can already do with the ropes and vines strewn about the world, the frog is awkwardly pulled from one anchor point to the next. It's just really stiff and clunky. And the flying squirrel can now actually fly, or, well, it can glide. It's nice to see some of the animals get more use before the credits, but the way this squirrel controls is anything but nice. The way that your glide speed is decided on seems to be transferred from what speed or direction you were falling before activation. So if you activate it at the height of your jump like you would think to do, you're going really slow. It's doable, but mainly just feels, again, stiff and clunky. The animals are put to good use when they're interacted with, but just in less complex or interesting ways, I find. Thankfully, however, something that was given a much higher priority this go around were the things that Tak is able to do. By and large, Tak controls very similarly to how he did in the first game. He runs and he jumps, as well as being given a few things that make traversal a hair more interesting this time. But seriously, not much, just a hair. The double jump hasn't been removed, but just given an upgrade, so to speak. Instead of just hopping again, Tak can now slowly glide a short distance after holding the jump button a second time. Firstly, I find it funny that most video game protagonists have a hard time keeping their gear and abilities between games, but here's Tak learning new skills between his games. And secondly, this ability doesn't come across as something that was given to the player to push their platforming to the test, or see how far they could push their speedrunning chops. Because of its slow speed and long duration, it feels more geared towards correction than anything else, making the game's platforming more accessible for players who might struggle with it, in other words. But seeing as how this next ability is more or less built for the speedrunner mentality, I have no issues with this glide. But first, real quick, let's talk about this meter right here. This is your spirit meter. When holding down the left trigger, Tak will enter this sort of enhanced mode. He essentially gets a boost to, well, everything. His movement speed increases, his jump height and distance increases, his glide is sped up, he can dish out more powerful attacks. Everything is given a boost, and everything is funneled through this meter. It sounds like a lot of choice on how you might want to spend this limited resource, right? Well, kind of. The gauge automatically refills over time. For traversal, this is an actual trade-off. You can't stay in the spirit state and just speedrun the level because the meter drains at a reasonable rate. You have to be considerate of when you need a speed boost or some extra distance to a jump or a glide. And as for combat, where do I even begin? It was confessed in that development diary that combat in the first game was more or less an afterthought, so when the team was given the chance to make a sequel, that was one of the first things they set out to improve upon. And I'm sure you're wondering, did they succeed? So the short version of it is, they expanded what Tak can do, but they didn't expand anything else. And the long version goes a little something like this. As we know, the original didn't give you much to work with. Tak could swing a thing at some things, or he could cast a spell 3 times throughout the entire game. Here in the sequel though, Tak has quite a number of new things he can do with his selection of weapons and magic. There's always the tried and true method of mashing the B button and beating the enemy senseless that way, but if an attack is thrown out after the first jump, Tak will do the spinning attack that was attached to the staff from the first game. And if an attack is done after the second jump or during the glide, he'll do this dive kick that has super strict spacing requirements. Tak can throw little magic projectiles from a distance to stun enemies. He's given new moves that can be performed with different button combinations. B followed by Y will do an uppercut that can tear through shield enemies. B then X will do this spin move that can be spammed if you can move your thumbs fast enough, and it makes me think of Crash's spin every time. And when you're in your enhanced spirit state, all the attacks change. B and Y performs this slam attack that does a good job of clearing out enemies. B and X is the best move in your arsenal. It rains down lightning on 2 targets if you're close enough and is almost always an instant kill. The dive kick is also given a massive boost by the spirit state and will make short work of even the biggest enemies. When Tak meets up with the Moon Juju about halfway through the game, she allows him to pick one spirit animal from a choice of 4, each giving him a different special attack. I went with Jaguar, and pressing X by itself in the spirit state will do this wide-reaching claw swipe move that takes care of annoying late game enemies in an instant. And last but not least, we also have access to these bolas, which make for some fun traversal in some areas, but also have the added benefit of bringing smaller enemies to Tak for a beatdown. All of these attacks are really satisfying to use correctly. The slow-mo that accompanies the powered-up attacks can get annoying, but actually can be skipped. Particle effects add a lot of charm, and the sound design is admirable even if it's heavily borrowed from the first game. The enemies do have some semblance of variety, which requires you know what attacks need to be used. Firstly, I want to say how much of a disappointment it is that Nurbles are nowhere to be seen in this game. The main antagonistic force this time around are the Woodies. It's not like they were infinitely better or anything, I just find the ravenous Nurbles to be far more entertaining, RIP to the legends. Anywho, we've got Shield Woodies who have to have their shields broken as previously discussed, Shaman Woodies who can revive other Woodies if not taken care of first, Titan Woodies who need a few more hits to take down if you don't do what I do and just use the Spirit Dive Kick move to put them in the dirt quickly. And then there are the Nightmare creatures. They're the basic kind that just need to be swatted like flies. There are these brain sucker dudes who latch on Tak's head if you don't hit them with a jumping attack. These spinning guys that annoy the hell out of me because they don't pack a big punch but instead throw you out of the arena. They can be taken out with that lightning attack, but they still frustrate me. There are these snake guys that turn invisible when you get close to them, so you have to stun them from a distance and then take them out. Well, invisible and invincible, I might add, because those are the same thing in this game. Invisible enemies can only be damaged outright by your spirit animal attack. There's this anglerfish enemy that spawns in clusters of spirit orbs. They can trap you if you don't recognize the situation beforehand. Then there's the toughest common enemy you fight. These cannon guys. They have the same invisible from a distance shtick as the snake guys, but they constantly shoot hard-hitting ranged attacks at you. They require a powered-up projectile to make them vulnerable so you can finish them off. I like this cast of enemies well enough. There are certain baddies that actually require certain aspects of your arsenal to beat. Well, without relying on the spirit animal attack later in the game. Tak has all of these amazing abilities at his disposal, and they really do a good job of making him a fun character to control. But these enemies don't pose any threat to Tak in any legitimate way, and the main problem for this is that spirit meter we talked about. It is so easy to fill that thing up and just go to absolute f***ing town on every single enemy you see. If you make sure to collect the spirit orbs that fallen enemies drop, then you can fill the meter back up and just continuously throw out ridiculously powerful attacks back to back. Bringing us to the second biggest problem the combat system has. Enemies don't really have any kind of defense from Tak's onslaught. If it's not a shield or they're completely invincible, then they don't have any means of protecting themselves against this overinflated moveset. No dodges, no counterattacks, no jumping out of the way. They just stand there and wait for you to come over and use whatever move you want to use most of the time. The only enemies that ever give me trouble are the cannon guys, and that's because they have such a large area of effect. Oh, and the stupid spinning assholes, because I seriously don't know how you're supposed to beat them other than throwing the lightning spell at them. When they came back and wanted to flesh out combat for a sequel, they made a great attempt with the new variety and multitude of things Tak can do now, but the enemies didn't evolve alongside him. There are more, yeah, but they just attack in different ways. Players like enemy engagement for combat systems like this, and if I was to play devil's advocate and go easy on them, saying they might not have wanted to make a robust combat system, they might have just wanted to give Tak more moves than a basic swing and some spells to boot, then I might come back and say that those priorities were maybe just a little misguided, don't you think? Many other areas of this game could have benefited from some more attention. The vehicle sections weren't very enjoyable. I guess the catapult was a good way to break up the on-foot action, but I didn't like it nearly as much. And whatever physics system was used to set this thing up needed some serious fine-tuning. The canoe sections, they can be a little finicky. That is up until the very last one, where I wanted to scream my lungs out because, oh my god, f*** this canoe for real. And there could have also stood to be several tweaks to the combat and how attacks hit their targets. For a game that was put out only a year after the previous one in the series, Tak 2 sure does a lot to shake up the formula. The animals, the structure, and even the overall quality of its presentation. I think this game looks pretty solid overall. Still the use of bright colors, the particle effects are still a joy, and this game has some gorgeous looking skyboxes. But here, my gripes are more technical. Most notably, the frame rate for the Gamecube version is absolutely pitiful. It's at least stable most of the time, but in sections like the first area and whenever Tak does his little level up animation, it just becomes really distracting for a few seconds. It makes me wonder if I chose the wrong home console for this little retrospective, but Music didn't grab me the same way the first one did either. The compositions from the first one had that clarity amongst the simplicity, but the songs here just feel generic now. Not a single one sticks out in my mind. There aren't really any good boss fights here either, just more of the same kind of stuff from the first game. At the end of the game, you'll have encounters with pins, needles, and Tlaloc. I noticed the one, I guess you could call it an Easter egg, where pins and needles will use the colored blast that were available in the one boss fight from the first game, but that's about all of that. Now, there are a few things I want to cover before we move on to the Game Boy version. As you go about the game world, you'll collect 3 different resources: bugs, crystals, and fruit, and you can use these ingredients to mix potions in the options menu, but these potions are really just cheats or unlockables. If you go off the beaten path, you can stumble across these little scrolls hidden throughout the game. There are several cosmetic changes you can make, like changing Tak's feather color to purple, changing the color of the particle effects, and etc., but you can only know the specific amount of ingredients if you can find the recipes. This makes for a pretty good incentive to go back through the game, because otherwise there really isn't a good reason. And haha, there still really isn't a good reason, because you can mix potions freely if you know the specific amount of ingredients. Shoutouts to my homies at the Tak 2 wiki. To be completely fair, you still do have to have enough resources to make the potions even if you know the recipes. And I could imagine a pair of younger siblings wanting these recipes because they also unlock characters for Tak 2's multiplayer mode. Okay, now I don't mean to oversell it, like it's no Mario Party, but some kids could get a good time out of this. These are the Dinky games, and at first I was impressed that they were able to make a multiplayer mode for a brand new game in just a year, so I drug Kelly into my madness and had her play around with me, and I quickly understood how they did it. Every game we played was a reused asset, if not a whole section from the first game. You can pick from a few characters, which is fun. I think JB is the best character for the sole reason that he makes this noise. Both boarding levels are here in their entirety, the pins and needles boss fights are here, this game has you interacting with the mummies, and so on and so forth. They tend to repeat themselves even if we played it before in the rotation. It's pretty much on the same level as Sonic and the Black Knights multiplayer if I could compare it to something. I didn't hate it, but it also wasn't totally amazing. It was just kinda dinky. And now for the portable version of the Staff of Dreams. Going off the foundation the original GBA game laid out, this is exactly what you would expect as far as the story is concerned, except heavily trimmed down. There are 3 worlds, so to speak, to get through: the swamp, the woodlands, and the planetarium, each containing 5 levels with a rift level opening after you complete the first 5. Then a dream fortress level and a final battle with Tlaloc before the credits roll. The optional collectibles like sheep are no more. The only goal the player has to worry about this time around is making it to the end of the level, which is very much appreciated. As you can also no doubt tell, we've seen quite a graphical upgrade since our last handheld adventure. Sprites and backgrounds are far more colorful than last time. Tak's new sprite is miles better than the one from the first game, but I can't be the only one that thinks his overworld sprite looks a tad naked? Similar to the console version, Tak has also seen some additions to his moveset. The Thwark is his only weapon here, so no Bola sadly. He can only swing it back and forth, meaning none of his special combos or moves from the console version were included. This doesn't mean he's completely out of cool attacks though. He can do a downward slam by tapping down twice in the air. He can spin dash by tapping down twice on the ground, which travels further after going down slopes. There's this pretty weird situational teleport move that he can do by pressing down and the A button. He can charge up a magical projectile, but no small projectiles are available. And he has his little double jump / glide thingy. Combat on a 2D plane is still really limited, however, as you could have guessed. A lot of enemies have weaknesses to certain moves like they do in the 3D game. Most can be taken down by the regular swing, but some require a bigger move to kill. I found myself using that slam move an awful lot because of how much splash damage it had. And some enemies are straight up invulnerable to certain moves. But here comes the worst part about this game. Ironically, one of my complaints with the console version was that the mana meter trivialized the combat system due to how strong it made Tak. Again, a lot of the blame could be placed on how easy it was to keep it full. It was like Tak had a blicky that never ran out of juice. And here it's the main annoyance because it's required to beat enemies and also progress in the stage. But it's an absolute chore to keep this thing filled up. Keeping the mana meter filled up can be done by drinking mana potions that you can save to Tak's inventory, or by going into the dream world and collecting mana orbs. Doesn't sound that bad, right? Well, it wouldn't be if the abilities that used mana didn't use so much of it, or if the dream world was something that could be accessed at any time you needed it. Peep that green vial in the top right corner. When that's full, you can enter the dream world and run around until it's tapped out. To refill the vial, you have to simply stand next to one of these big green vats. That's it. Why would you make a limited resource replenish by using another limited resource? Yeah, it's not the only way to get more mana thanks to potions, but those are already in such limited numbers that it's unwise to use them willy-nilly. And then you're stuck with having to do it the old-fashioned way. You go find one of the vats that are thankfully all over the place, stand in front of it, go into the dream world, grab mana orbs and pray that there are enough to fill the meter, then stand in front of it again to get more dream juice just to continue on with the level. It was so tedious doing this over and over because, like I said, a lot of the enemies have to be taken out with a special move. I used the slam attack a lot because it seemed to take out almost every enemy in one shot. But God forbid there's an instance where you have to use the little teleport thing. If you don't have an absurd amount of mana, that's a really fun game of ring around the dream world you're about to play. Other than that though, level design ranges from mediocre to aggravating. The earlier levels are pretty generic but harmless 2D platformer levels that just show you a short good time. But then the game busts out its favorite thing ever, instant death pits. No kidding, these things are everywhere. And they especially love to put them over these platforms that look exactly alike but can do different things. Sometimes they just fall after you land on them. Sometimes they fall slowly. Sometimes they want you to run on them to elevate yourself. Sometimes they're fat. They are constantly inconsistent though. But these bottomless pits, they frustrate me so badly because you have to play the level in its entirety over again if you get caught by the cheapness. The only levels with any sort of checkpoints are the rift levels. They're the typical levels that you've been fighting through until you reach the rift at the end and wake up 5 Pupanunu villagers. This activates a time limit and sends you into the dream world permanently while you race back to the beginning of the level. I actually really liked these sections. They were like little tests to see if you remember the level you just cleared and if you could clear it backwards but with some new platforms in certain places. It's exactly like the ends of the levels from Wario Land 4, one of my favorite GBA games ever. So that's probably why. It makes sense that none of the animals are used in the rift levels though, because the animals are horrible here. The poor animals, man, they got it so rough. There are only 3, excluding the sheep, which are basically just springs this time around, so they hardly count. The turtle can carry you across poison water that you can just jump over yourself. The bear can carry you across rushing water that you can pretty much just jump over yourself. And the bird carries you across bottomless pits that you can't just jump over yourself. The bear in particular sucks only because of these little tunnels you have to pass through. The bear stops when he comes in front of an enemy, which have been placed inside these logs. Plus the logs are so low that they stop you from jumping inside them, which validates the water obstacle, so I guess I'll allow it. But what I won't allow is how much time this wastes when I can't get to the enemies to kill them, so the stupid bear won't stop in front of them, forcing me to trudge back down the river and try it all over again. There's just a lot of unnecessary frustration in the Game Boy version. The inventory system is neat, but all the resources are used up too quickly if it's relied on too much. And if you rely on the other methods we discussed, it wastes too much time. I also just didn't know what a bunch of these items did. Obviously the red jar heals me and the blue one gives me magic, but one of these fills up my dream juice and one turns me invincible for a second. And then I also found a meteor shower item that I accidentally used on the final boss to beat it. It was cool, but it also felt really out of left field. I find no merit in playing this version when it has so many issues and is outclassed by the console game in every way. So with that being said, we're on to the final chapter of the Tak and the Power of Juju trilogy. Released on September 19th, 2005, Tak and the Great Juju Challenge was a direct follow-up and final entry in the original Tak franchise. Jumping straight in here, the audience is once again brought into the game as a Juju by Jabulba.
You're in the middle of the Poopanunu people's pig pen, and you're covered with Poopanunu people's pig poo-poo. Oh.
The old shaman explains that the first Great Juju Challenge in over 60 years is getting ready to kick off. I don't know why they took a break. Maybe they had a global pandemic to deal with too? Who knows? But with several tribes preparing to compete for the favor of the Moon Juju, this event is a big deal. But our heroes Tak and Locke were supposed to be back hours ago with a phoenix feather. We then fade to Tak and Locke's predicament. And I'm sorry, but I have to just show you guys this whole clip.
So, this is how it all ends. The lock can't go on no more. Bye-bye, sweet world. Hey-yo! Magnificent, what an incredible feeling!
Okay, that's enough.
This game, even more so than the other two games, are so funny, and a big contributing factor to that is how much time Tak and Locke get to bounce off each other for some spectacularly fun exchanges. There are genuinely great moments between them, none that really develop any kind of emotional relationship or anything, but instead they offer brilliantly performed and well-animated jokes like this one.
You'll have to climb those vines. I'll cover you.
Why is the Locke always the one ducking cannonballs? You can maneuver a heavy cannon, but you're too weak to climb up a cliff. You're faking it!
Locke, I'll just fall off and waste too much time.
I'm waiting.
Waiting for what?
I'm waiting. Go on.
Oh, mighty Locke. You are the biggest, baddest warrior in the world, whereas I am built like a puny, disease-infested squirrel. All of the girls in the village love you, but as for me, they think I smell like skunk poo. I'm so stupid and dumb and have fleas in my hair, and my dream is to eat Jibulba's dirty underwear. You are a beefy, strong stallion and greater than me. You should have been the hero of the Pupanunu prophecy.
Okay, Tak, I'll go, but only because you asked nicely.
Because as far as the story goes this time around, I think the humorous exchanges are the most you're going to get out of it. Tak and Locke stay ahead of the curve throughout the Great Juju Challenge, constantly pulling ahead in the scoreboard as other tribes get eliminated from the competition. But things start to get a little hairy when the Black Mist tribe starts to cheat in very obvious ways, getting other teams framed for sabotage, blatantly changing the scoreboard, and other dumb stuff that I'm surprised none of the judges catch them. It's eventually revealed that the smaller one is a Juju himself and is trying to win the favor of the Moon Juju because he's had a crush on her since they were kids.
Just search your feelings. What do they say?
Oh, I'm going to be sick.
I love you. I have always loved you.
I just threw up in my mouth.
I loved you since we were just little Jujus and you was that gangly, buck-toothed, big-footed girl up the street.
Even though at one point you can see them both talking to the Juju, so I don't really know. But the final showdown eventually comes down to the tall guy from the Black Mist tribe and this Juju named Travis. No, I'm not kidding.
Travis?
Yes, my velvet moonbee.
Versus the Pupanunu warriors. And of course, Tak and Locke come out on top, and that's it. No, seriously, after the players win the battle, it just cuts back to the village, with Locke thinking there's about to be a surprise party, but then Jibulba chimes in saying they've already gone over budget, so all you get is this party horn. It's kind of funny, but also very anticlimactic. Like I said, the story as a story is lacking. Nothing really happens. We get a little bit of world building for the series, I guess, seeing all the different tribes and whatnot, but there's no real progress. It's all about these small instances of Tak and Locke interacting with each other or the returning characters from the previous games. Plenty of familiar Juju show up to help them out, and they even receive help from Tlaloc, with him claiming that the Great Juju Challenge is bigger than the squabble they have. It's all cute, but not what I would call a good way to wrap up a trilogy as far as the story goes. But on the video game front, things fare much better. As we're all aware, this game was built from the ground up as a co-op experience. Tak and Locke are the central protagonist, and they have to work together to fight enemies, solve simple puzzles, and get through some sporadic set pieces. If you go the journey solo, the AI will take control of whichever character you're not. I can't speak on the strength of the computer-controlled character because I was lucky enough to have Nick to play through the entire game with me. And as a baseline, this is a really fun co-op game. Tak and Locke both have the same base abilities. Pretty much everything that was established in the Staff of Dreams has returned here. Jumping and gliding a short distance, the Juju boost is still here, Tak still has all of his combos from before and they work just as well. The uppercut is still neat, but the spin move is just as broken and I love it. He still has his magic projectile and that beautiful dive kick move. But then we have our boy Locke, a far more physical fighter. He uses his hammer for big strikes and AoE damage. In all fairness, there isn't an enemy type that Locke is required to take down because Tak can't, and vice versa. It's interesting enough that the same inputs for each character have different uses in combat. For example, these turtle enemies have to be flipped over before they can be damaged. At first we thought that Locke had to use his hammer slam to flip them over, but then we discovered that Tak's dive kick could flip them just as easily. It's a very small thing, but I think it goes a long way to driving home that they both have very different ways of completing the same goal, and that helps toward making them feel unique from one another. They also gain access to a large variety of spells thanks to several familiar faces as the competition progresses. Dead Juju gives Tak the grapple spell that works exactly as the bolas did in Tak 2, only this time it's used as a puzzle solving tool as it's best for pulling Locke across gaps to reunite the pair. He also gives Locke a healing spell, but I barely saw Nick use it. Tlaloc shows up and gives Tak a powerful spell that launches spirits at enemies, and gives Locke the ability to taunt enemies, as well as several Jujus appearing from time to time to upgrade the boy's melee damage, health, and mana capacity. The only special move that Tak doesn't have by the end is the spirit animal attack, which is kind of sad if I'm being real, but it's alright. The returning chicken suit for Tak is put to good use in a level or two towards the end, but Locke is given the honor of a lobster suit to traverse underwater. The structure of the Great Juju Challenge is even more streamlined than the Staff of Dreams, if you can believe it. The adventure is broken up into these bite-sized levels that are full of puzzles, platforming, and combat encounters, all while fighting against a time limit. After a couple 3 or so levels, the tribes will all meet in the Juju realm for these really awkward demolition derby exhibitions to see which tribe gets eliminated. Throughout the main levels, Juju torches act as checkpoints for the boys to respawn at after a death, as well as adding time back to the clock. As far as the levels themselves go, they're pretty decently designed. Tak and Locke both have different privileges to interact with certain things in the levels, but the both of them also have to work together to keep progressing in the level. Another IGN dev diary exists for the Great Juju Challenge, and they found that during testing, players would often run ahead of each other and generally not work together like they should be. So to remedy this, the team added these risen Juju torches that require both players to activate. Locke will have to pick Tak up and hoist him up higher to light it because neither of them can reach it on their own. This simple change creates a blockade that at the same time encourages each player to explore and find extras on their own, while also forcing both of them to come back together several times throughout each level. Risen Juju torches aren't the only co-op choke point though. Locke, as the big strong man, can climb on vines to reach areas Tak can't. Thorny vines are used everywhere to block pathways, but the duo has to work together to get barrels of boom dust over to them. Of course, Locke can maneuver fine with them, but per usual, Tak struggles. But Tak can comfortably swim in bodies of water, meanwhile piranhas will attack Locke if he tries. The lobster and chicken suits are also included in that list, but they're only things for a few levels. Again, I love that the game has these creative means of forcing the duo to separate and rejoin, while also having its fair share of levels where they have to stick together. The animals are back and have some fun twists on them. Rhinos make a few appearances. A few involve a baby rhino that Locke has to retrieve in order to wake up the bigger ones for the boys to ride. The rest of the rhinos' appearances see them already awake or woken up by a stink cloud. Mammoths make an introduction here, but they do the exact same things that rhinos do, allowing you to break through thorny vines that block the path, and gorillas will act as they always have towards Tak, but if Locke tries to get close to them, he'll be grabbed and loved on, so they have to work together to make Locke stink in order to get past them. It's aspects like this that elevate this from yet another linear Tak game into a genuinely fantastic couch co-op experience. The ways in which both players have to communicate and problem solve were the best moments of the game for me. Talking out the solutions to puzzles and then cheering the other on to finish their half of the challenge was great fun, and it was actually even better when we couldn't find a solution, but did come across an exploit that let us skip the challenge altogether. I'm going to remember those moments for a while to come. Optional side challenges were also a priority anytime we came across them. The challenges vary from smacking some chickens around, using turrets to destroy some bad guys, using a cannon to guide a baby rhino to its mom. They're all pretty basic extra challenges, but that's not a negative in the slightest. Combat was probably the least engaging part of the package, but it wasn't horrible. I think by this third chapter they really have a grasp on what combat needs to be for players to have a fun time, but also not overstay its welcome. I'm always going to say that any co-op game with any kind of combat would benefit greatly from team attacks where both players participate. But it's alright. Enemies go down relatively easily thanks to the abundance of spells and powerful moves the boys get, and also the enemies don't tend to put up much of a challenge, which is also appreciated. I'm glad the focus is on the cooperative elements rather than the merely passable combat. I did have several moments where I was like, whoa, whoa, because the Great Juju Challenge has very few unique assets, which to be honest never really got on my nerves. It kind of gives the game a victory lap feel to it in a weird way. Like, I'm sure I looked at Nick and said, oh, this exact chunk is from the swamp level in the second game. Oh, this is from the second game. This minigame is just the same minigame from the first game, and then the second game too. But again, I don't think I minded. As I said in the introduction, I remember this one being kind of boring as a kid. I don't know if I would still say it's boring, but it certainly isn't anything unique as far as 3D platformers go. I'm probably a little blinded by the fun I had playing through this game with my friend, but the novelty of playing a co-op Tak game is the selling point for this one. And I think it's an appropriate one. The lackluster story that was supposed to cap off a trilogy of games didn't do much for me besides make me laugh. But the Great Juju Challenge still has merit. And now, let's get this over with. We gotta take a quick detour into the handheld versions now. And yes, that was a plural S you heard. We have a Game Boy Advanced version as well as a completely different handheld version on the Nintendo DS. But let's begin with the GBA version. Today's developer isn't Helix Software like it has been up until this point. No, I was actually surprised when I saw the Way Forward logo upon booting this baby up. For those who are unaware, Way Forward is responsible for the Shantae series, as well as a few others like Mighty Switch Force. I've never played any of them myself, but the legacy is undeniable. So we have some seasoned handheld software developers at the helm this time. And to start things off, if you know Way Forward, you know they have some extremely talented artists on their team, and this shines through in the Great Juju Challenge. The portraits of all the characters for dialogue exchanges are quite a style shift from what we're used to in the GBA games. I think some of them can look a little off at times, but on the whole, these renditions of the cast look good. Undeniably a breath of fresh air at the very least if it's not your cup of tea stylistically. The story this time starts off very similarly to the console version, but after they start the challenge, things get a little more standard, for lack of a better word. So instead of the Jujus having set up this challenge for all the tribes to compete for the best time and performances and all that jazz, it's a little more f***y-wucky. So progression is far more Mario, as you can clearly see here. In this game, Tak and Locke have to run through the homelands of each tribe to beat them, ? The Gramazons, the Mind Raiders, the Jibba Jabbas exclusive to the GBA version are the Zoopians and the Black Mist. After 3 levels, they have a battle with an unrelated Juju before moving on. The very same Jujus that were giving them spells and helping them in the console game. It's a little jarring, for sure, but even more jarring is that every world closes out with a race in these stupid cars instead of a demolition derby in the stupid cars. I sucked at the first one because I didn't understand it, but then I won every other one on my first attempt. Then the game just kinda ends with the Moon Juju saying, "Good job." There's no plot about the Black Mist being dickheads, no conspiracy, no cheating. It's far more stripped down than before. There was this boss fight with a brand new Juju who was before the final level, and I thought this was going to be a surprise Tlaloc fight, but no, it's just some evil dude. Okay. The closest we get to any kind of character conflict is when in their respective stages, the enemy teams show up like Pokemon trainers preparing to send out a Pokemon, and then some sort of something starts falling for a second. And I guess you have these short little dialogue exchanges where Tak and Locke interact with them, but these don't hold a candle to the console game's interactions. If you ever wanted to know the importance of voice actors, look no further than these two versions of the same game. In the GBA game, the writing is very similar to the console version. But the difference here is that the dialogue doesn't read as well as it does when spoken. For most of the cast, it's fine. The Jujus or whatever, and I can take or leave Tak and Jibulba. But reading these lines isn't the same as hearing someone as talented as Patrick Warburton perform them.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying.
Allow me, Tak, I'm fluent in their language. Are you wounded or in need of medical attention? 2 words, sounds like something Nemu. Monkey for steam fungus. No, wait. Oh! Okay, they want a burrito.
Allow me, Tak. I speak fluent Jibba Jabba. Are you wounded or in need of medical attention? Something emu, cuisine, monkey fluff, steamed fungus. Oh, you want a burrito?
The writing on its own is just too childish to get a genuine laugh out of me without Kronk's delivery. Good voice talent does make a difference, ladies and gentlemen. Could you imagine if they did this to someone like my boy JB? Okay, but what of the game itself? Well, the player controls both Tak and Locke at the same time here. Each of them have their own unique skills though. Thankfully, they gave both some tools that complement the other this time. Tak is now relegated to a long-range projectile. It's just a singular blast, but that never gets in the way. Since all of the boys' attacks can basically be spam, taking enemies down is never a problem. It makes the power-ups to Tak's fireballs that can turn it into a flamethrower or something that plumes up from the ground nice to have, but they ultimately feel unnecessary. Now switching to Locke, he has a club that he can swing in front of him, and for some reason, all of the team actions can only be performed when in control of Locke, which makes the list of both guys' pros and cons a bit shorter on Tak's side. By tapping the D-pad in a direction twice, the pair will start to dash, but they aren't invincible or anything, so be careful with that one. A short dash will also happen when in the air, and they even take advantage of this for optional goodies as well as mandatory progression. We have a slam attack, but thankfully the enemies aren't tanks like in Tak 2 GBA, so I wasn't relying on it to keep a move on. They can also huddle up and have Tak create a barrier over them to protect them from hazards that works about 90% of the time. and they also have a slide move that they can do if they crouch on an incline for long enough. But they don't do damage during it, so I'm curious as to what the point even was there. As I mentioned a moment ago, enemies aren't nearly as tanky as they were in Tak 2 GBA, so they're almost always non-issues in this game, which is a big improvement to me. They can mostly all be taken down with one hit, or a few more thanks to how spammable Tak and Locke's attacks are. There is one exception though, these little guys right here. So they have shields that both Locke and Tak can break on their own. However, their bodies are immune to magic, so you have to swap back to Locke to finish them off. All I wanted from the console game was an enemy like this, an enemy that forced both players to participate in the same fight, an enemy that made them depend on each other. Man, I love these guys for that. It's a shame they're the only enemy like this in the game, but it was a valiant attempt. I also just like the way all the enemies look this time around. There are some woodies here and there and some of these rock guys too, but then we also have the cool looking shield guys, and good lord, these abominations look like something from a creepypasta or the forest demon from Smiling Friends. But okay, I've been too nice to this game for too long, it's time to bring it down a peg. For all of the things that make this genuinely the best Tak game on this system, it still comes with a cautious recommend from me. And that is solely because of the level design in a few areas. For the most part, it's pretty standard stuff, running and jumping across moving and disappearing platforms, finding secret optional areas that act as mini brain teasers, exploring to find permanent mana and health increases. It's a grand old time, until our good friend Mr. Screen Crunch decides to pay us a visit. And boy does he not know when to go home this time. It actually feels like you have to make a leap of faith at least once per level in this game. This level ends with a leap of faith, for fuck's sake. It got to the point where I didn't know what pits were pits and which ones weren't anymore. It is the biggest drawback the game has going against it for sure. I think the original GBA game was more annoying to deal with, but it's still pretty bad here. I mean, look at how the camera follows the characters during a do-or-die platforming section. The platforms completely go out of view at the height of each jump. It's nerve-wracking. And that's without even mentioning the ridiculous spikes in difficulty or the things that they expect you to react to within milliseconds. The first level of the Mind Raiders world has a boulder chase towards the middle across some disappearing platforms, but then you eventually get to a platform against a wall. So in a split-second decision, I kept holding forward, but that got me killed. What I was supposed to do is just stand there and seemingly fall to my doom. The game is full of fun little instances like this. I almost lost my mind on the second Jibba Jabba's level. The gimmick is that the water level continues to rise as you play, so you have to be wary about how to get the higher ground when you need it. But the water doesn't gradually rise, it shoots up immediately on its own little cycle. This caused me so many deaths and so much frustration. And there are very few checkpoints in these levels, so when you suffer a death that feels unwarranted, it can be very demoralizing. Thankfully, the puzzle solving makes somewhat of an appearance here from the console game. Tak and Locke often have to split up to open gateways so the other can rejoin. Whether that be through a separate gauntlet designed for that character, a switch that one has to hold down while the other retrieves an object, or donning the chicken and lobster suits that are on 10-second timers for some reason. And after each world is conquered and the boss fight is done, we have these little top-down races that replace the demolition derby of the console game. They aren't really bad, but they're not exactly noteworthy either. If we can continue to move back towards a more positive note here, the animals are at least consistently used. The rhinos are good for charging through stone that separates the duo. The baby rhinos are here, but it kind of feels like they don't really do anything. I think they're supposed to wake up the bigger rhinos, but it didn't feel like they were asleep when I came up to them. Instead, it just looks like the baby rhinos freak the older ones out over and over. Sheep are all over the place and act as trampolines that can be carried around. Chickens return as egg protectors and will make Tak or Locke drop the egg if they can hit them. Thankfully, it doesn't break, unlike a certain chicken temple I know of. I think that was it. Oh wait, no, there's one bear in the second Gramazon level. He throws the boys in whatever direction he's facing, with no difference for who's in the lead. So yeah, the dynamic of which Poopanunu interacts with which animal is missing here. Way Forward probably did make the best GBA Tak game. I mean that too. This was the best of the trilogy as far as the Game Boy Advance goes. The usual trappings of screen crunch and limited art and sound of course show up, but the platforming and combat are enjoyable. But I still don't think you should run out and find a copy of this game for that alone. The spikes in difficulty and forgettable comedy make the console version superior to this version in every way. But what do you say we take a look at this DS version, huh? Okay, so going into this, I had no expectations whatsoever, but I gotta say, This is the best handheld Tak game I've played for this video. Of course, that's not saying much, but the statement still stands. Behind the captain's chair today, we have a first for this franchise, a Japanese studio. Ultron Corporation is a Shinagawa, Tokyo-based company that's been behind more licensed games than you can count on two hands. That's really it though, they've just been one of those go-to companies that can crank out a game based on an existing IP. Can't say I'm personally familiar with their catalog, however. But anywho, let's quickly cover the changes the DS version brings to the story. So the way the events are told is word for word the way the console version tells the story, and I mean literally. It's like the cinematics in the game were copied and pasted from the script of the console game. They even type out actions that characters perform in the scene. It's not a big deal, but it was pretty distracting. Tak and Locke's banter isn't nearly as entertaining though. As weird as it is to bring this up, they're too nice to each other. The playful rivalry that they had in the console version makes their relationship more relatable. Ever since the Staff of Dreams, Locke has had this ever so slightly bitter attitude towards Tak, because he was the prophesized warrior instead of him.
And at night, we'd sit by the campfire and sing songs of how I would fulfill the Pupanunu prophecy. I was Jibulba's favorite then.
Can we go?
Right.
But here, when they aren't copying the script from the console game, they have zero friction. I'll bring up the chicken suit scene here. Tak brings out the suit and Locke is like, "Wow, Tak, that is awesome. That should help a lot. Great job. Now let's fucking make out or something." It just sucks away any potential comedy from their dynamic. They're too sweet to one another. Now, not too far in, we do go off the rails a little bit. First minor change we see is Death Juju being Tak and Locke's point man, so to speak. He's kind of like the duo's guide, pointing them in the right direction and stuff. There's also way more interaction with each of the tribes as the level progresses. The boys will have run-ins with the Gramazons, Jibba Jabbas, and Black Mist during the stages, which really helps kind of drive home this whole competition thing. Then after the Jibba Jabbas are eliminated, we're shown a scene of both Black Mist tribe members speaking with Travis, or as he's called in this game, the Dark Juju. He tells the two that they have to step it up if they wish to get the power of the Moon Juju. After the Black Mist gets the Gramazons eliminated, the Moon Juju makes an appearance to remind everyone that whoever wins will get the power of the Moon Juju. So yeah, instead of just getting her favor, the winners will apparently get the full force of whatever power the Moon Juju has at their beck and call. And in a very black and white way, the Black Mist say that they are evil and will use it for brutality and humiliation. I could be wrong, but I always got the impression that this was more of a friendly contest between neighboring tribes, not a tournament which decides the exclusive control over a literal god. This feels like the words that would get someone ejected from such an event, no? But then we pan over to Krug, the smaller Black Mist guy, and he's looking a little different. And as the subtitles give away, I guess Dark Juju has possessed him now. Okay, but moving on, we eventually find the original Krug tied up because Dark Juju wanted to get rid of the weakest link. We even find out that this little guy is the shaman of the Black Mist tribe. Kinda interesting. But after this, he helps the Pupanunu warriors reach the Black Mist, which leads to a final showdown not in a stupid car for once, but rather an actual boss battle against the Dark Juju. Then it ends just like the console game with no more or less depth. It's kinda cool that there was some more context given to the contestants in this game about a competition. I think the original game could have greatly benefited from some extra interaction during the levels, and I don't hate the little bits of mystery that the Black Mist had surrounding them this time. Oh, and I failed to mention this little tidbit up until now, but in Tak 2, when talking to JB about his lack of a real name, they mentioned this.
For me.
Oh, can it, JB? Mom was very busy. Dad was off fighting those wars with the Black Mist, lost all of his fingers.
Well, that certainly is interesting. Maybe these Juju challenges do have more on the line than we initially thought. But that's certainly not important here. But now on to the real shocker. This game is pretty stinking good, and I don't mean good for a handheld, I mean it's good. We've got ourselves a 3D action platformer for the Nintendo DS. The boys can do pretty much everything we've known them to do, so I don't need to go into that too deep. Difference here is when you need to swap to the other character, whether it be to climb some vines or swim in a body of water, you simply touch them down on the bottom screen. You can use this to do the two things I mentioned and nothing else, because those are the only unique things that set the boys apart here. It's not a big deal because there is way less focus on the animals and other staple Tak elements. The only animals that make appearances here are rhinos, mammoths, and sheep. Rhinos will charge through wooden fences when you smack their baby around, I honestly can't blame them. Mammoths can be ridden and break through wooden fences, and sheep can hold down switches and mechanisms. You even have to use it to get past stretches of land where alligators will jump out of the water and eat the boys whole like in the second game. The rhinos are pretty disappointing because for both instances they're used, the baby is right in front of them, so you just have to hit the baby. The mammoth appears one time and is pretty fun, but the section is so short it makes me wonder why it was even created in the first place. And then the sheep did what I said. They hold switches and run on wheels, nothing interesting about it. The animals feel like something that was shoehorned in to keep this game more in line with the original. I don't hate them, but they feel decidedly less important than anything else. Definitely further down on the totem pole than the slew of mini-games we have here. So a lot of those extra interactions with the other teams will be followed by a mini-game that often utilizes the DS's touchscreen. Flinging tack at the jibba jabbas to light some torches, racing the Gramazons on rhinos, awkwardly flying with the chicken suit, rowing down the river, which gave me big ol' war flashbacks from the canoe segment in Staff of Creams, but none of them are anything that I'd ever go back to. They're neat at best, I would say. The demolition derbies of the console game that turned into top-down RC racing with a limited camera has now been turned into fully 3D Crash Team racing with none of the charm and the most frustrating controls ever. But it's really nothing remarkable. There are no items or special power-ups, it's just driving and drifting around tight corners. You don't even have to come in first, you just actually can't come in dead last. And this is good because the AI very obviously doesn't have to follow the rules that you do. With the zipping and flying all over the place, it'd be really annoying if I had to win. What makes this game great is everything else. You're going to see my true colors here, folks. One of the things that makes me love this game so much is the way the combat is set up. Leave it to a relatively unknown Japanese studio to make the best feeling combat system this franchise has ever seen. It all comes down to how good connecting a hit feels. Obviously, this isn't anything to give Devil May Cry a run for its money, but it's pretty fun to mess around with the tools they've given Tak. Yeah, Locke doesn't really have any combo game here, sorry bud. The boys will gain new abilities and perks by collecting these gems that fall out of defeated enemies. This will give them new combos and special attacks. Tak's basic combo eventually turns into a launcher and it just tickled the itch for me. I know it doesn't look like much, but I was constantly trying to see how many attacks I could chain together. And the collecting of different resources returns here too. But now, before each level, a Juju friend will sell you blessing gems that can add bonuses to each character. They don't gain experience collectively though, so you will want to keep Locke caught up with Tak. Every other level up rewards a slot for these gems. There are gems that grant special abilities like a short dash for both characters, these super moves that can really come in handy in a pinch, like Tak being able to freeze enemies in place, Locke getting a buff to his attack power. You can buy upgrades for the car like better control? I'm not even going to touch that one. Or the much more practical stat increases you can give to each character. It was surprisingly fun to deck Tak out with mana regeneration buffs so he could abuse that dash to get in close for his hard-hitting Juju attacks to blow the enemy away, and giving Locke attack buff after attack buff allowed him to hurt the final boss. Enemies had a bad tendency to knock the boys down for a while, and then right as they were preparing to get up, a new attack would be coming at them again. It was kind of frustrating, but at the same time, when I was able to stun lock even the bigger goons with a combo until they died, I forgot about the frustration. The bigger frustration was the camera though, but as anyone who has ever played an action game before knows, the camera is almost always a problem. The frame rate also took some major hits in the opening levels, but smoothed out very nicely as we progressed. There is a hard mode that unlocks after beating the game, and after putting a few minutes into it, it doesn't seem to be much of a hard mode at all. The boys' progress remains though, so if you want a new game plus extra run, that's certainly an option. There are a few alternate costumes that you can apparently get in this new game plus though, so that's definitely an upside for the completionists out there. This was a very pleasant surprise to play through. While it's not the magnum opus of the Tak series so far, I do think it's the best handheld game the franchise has seen. The game is short, just under 3 hours to complete it the first time. But it sure as heck was a treat to play through for the surprise of that combat system alone. The platforming was also pretty solid throughout. It was kept pretty basic, but I don't think the DS needs anything like that. And speaking of the touchscreen, I didn't love any of the little mini games, but none of them were awful. Even though it was weird that the chicken suit was only in a mini game and Locke got to use the lobster suit in-game. I sure hope there aren't any other arbitrary changes that shake up the entire foundation of everything we've looked at today up ahead.
I don't think that's true.
Oh my God,
Oh boy.
Okay, look, I know it's just a kid's show at the end of the day, I know I'm not the target audience, and all that is well and good, but that doesn't mean that the show has to be an absolute bore fest to get through. Well, first of all, I have no idea why they thought Tak, of all the series out there, needed a reboot. I can't find any information on why they decided to go through with all these changes and continuity rewrites, most notably changing many of the original voice cast for this new era of Tak. The titular hero is no longer voiced by Jason Marsden, best known for his role as Max Goof, but instead, Tak is now voiced by Hal Sparks. Jabulba is now voiced by Lloyd Sher instead of John Kassir. Jabulba is also now Tak's uncle because in the show's 19th episode, which is an hour-long special that acts as an introduction to the new canon, Tak is revealed to be the child of a Juju. One of the most powerful Jujus, in fact, and Dark Juju, or Travis as I will forever know him, is trying to kill him because the two were in love. No Moon Juju, no Fauna, and most egregiously, no Flora. Most of the recognizable Jujus that we've come to know and love have had their voices changed. So hearing Dinky Juju sound like this?
I'm not a baby. I'm a 700-year-old Juju.
It's just weird because they should sound like this.
Sorry, but you've been voted off the island, pal. Fly! Be free!
I can't help but tighten my fists and scowl. I also miss Rob Paulson's portrayal of Psychic Juju. They had the common sense to bring him back to voice Dead Juju, or as he's now known, Party Juju. It honestly makes a little more sense than the other name, so I can't be too mad. I also miss seeing the villains and enemies that I've come to know and love in the games. The Woodies show up twice throughout the entire series, and that's it. And pour one out for the Nurbles if you remember them. Tlaloc has his own episode dedicated to him coming into the village and trying to replace Jabulba as the shaman before he's outsmarted by everyone else. Rob Paulson was replaced as Tlaloc in the show by Jeff Bennett, who I always remember as Dexter's dad. But not a pins or needles to be seen. The way in which the show pays homage to the games while also kind of ignoring a lot about them is one of the most frustrating aspects of watching through it. And as for the original stuff it brings to the table, there really isn't much. The Pupanunu tribe for the first time ever has more members than Tak, Locke, and Jabulba, and some sheep. There is a whole cast of periodically annoying characters that these 11-minute short stories revolve around. Tak's new best friends include Kiko, a laid-back orphan caveman stereotype voiced by a pitched-up John DiMaggio, and Jira, a tomgirl with a heavily implied will-they-won't-they romance with Tak. Jira is actually the daughter of Chief Pupanunu, a big, fat, and dumb guy. That's about it with the chief, honestly. Zarya is the stuck-up older sister of Jira and the next in line to be chief. Slog is this super strong Neanderthal girl that's in love with Locke, and that's all she does. And Locke is just Locke. He hasn't changed at all. There's the colorful cast of new and returning Jujus like I mentioned, as well as a few other miscellaneous Pupanunu. Bad thing is, the show makes no effort into making these characters likable or even learn any meaningful lessons from episode to episode. Every script just screams this was written by adult writers. I would be interested in these characters if they went on compelling adventures, but every single conflict feels so forced and childish that I don't see the point. If it's not the ridiculous scenarios that lack any subtlety, looking at repulsive Juju, it's something like episode 9. Tak has to defend Locke in a Juju trial for routinely disrespecting Juju, but even after he's found guilty and Tak has to try and get him to clear his name by apologizing, he still messes everything up. And then by the end, after causing even more trouble, he's eventually pardoned because the jury realizes it's not his fault for being that stupid? This feels like they had to rush to an ending after just writing on and then eventually using it because they'd put so much time into it at that point. For a kid's show, not only is it unfunny, but what kind of message does it teach kids watching it? It's okay to always be inconsiderate and rude as long as you're also hopelessly stupid? That's a horrible lesson to teach kids. And then, just as they're about to be sent back home, he insults the judge again. But the episode ends. Haha, how hilarious. And Tak is no longer the level-headed but goofy hero of a prophecy like in the games. He's now written to be this jealous, selfish, entitled brat with Juju powers to make anything he wants happen. But whenever he does try to make things go his way, it ends up on its head and everyone else around him suffers. He straight up turns the two rich kid bullies into sheep in one episode and has to be begged to rescue them from a carnivorous bird creature. He does make the right call by the end most of the time, but that still means we're watching with no empathy towards these characters and their situations for the entire 11 minutes. I honestly don't know which protagonist was treated with less respect in their television adaptation, Master Chief or Tak. I mean, it's really a toss-up between these two. With the writing being consistently irredeemable, the only thing I could hope to do was watch and write down instances where I saw the animals like rhinos, ostriches, the orangutans, etc. Or things that look really funny out of context.
You know how I struggled with shyness and the fact that I was born looking pregnant.
And even if there was the occasional line that got a real smile out of me,
Man, what is wrong with my poor dad?
Chira, what's the matter? Why are you crying?
Daddy?
Chief Bloated Dodge doesn't like to see tears. He only likes to see smiles, like when the monkeys hold each other and...
I would still be repulsed by the quality of the animation. I'm known to be a fan of high quality animation, but who isn't, am I right? This is just fun to watch. But I can understand that not every show has the budget or even the ability to make something look outstanding. Children's shows especially, even though that hasn't stopped some amazing looking kid shows from coming out. But anyway, Tak and the Power of Juju was apparently the first in-house CG animated show from Nickelodeon. You might think that was Jimmy Neutron, but it was animated by DNA Productions.
Hi, my name is Jeff.
Tak was the first to be animated at the Big Orange Slime's animation house. That sounds really cool, like the show would be given extra love and care, or the tools used would be proprietary and put to use in a special way. But nope, this is the ugliest animated show I can currently think of. And if you try to say home movies, I will punch you through the screen. That shit is charming.
I overheard that she's single, and I just wanted to let her know that I'm rich.
Really? You're a millionaire?
No, I'm Richard.
Oh.
Does Mama like what she sees?
I mean, for starters, it has some of the most unnatural, herky-jerk motions I've ever seen. I'm no animator myself, but it really looks like they just move from keyframe to keyframe sometimes. I counted more than one occasion where characters' body parts were legitimately clipping into each other. Like, seriously, how did someone let this happen? You can look at the characters' mouths at pretty much any moment during the show and the lip sync won't be matching what they're saying.
Astonishing! Glorious! It makes me want to bow down and worship at its feet.
It's actually frustrating to try and keep an eye on the lips because of how inconsistent the lip sync is. When they did this liquid sim in this episode, it was supposed to be milk, but they added no specular element to it, so it's just solid white with no reflective qualities at all. It just looks like they dragged a color onto the material and called it a day. I've been able to squeeze out very surface level laughs from this show by completely ignoring all context. Like when this happened, I was just thinking to myself about making a Radon joke for this video. Maybe even one of these if we want to get a little juvenile.
Stop trying to trick me, put it right here.
But that's all I think I care to rag on this show. I was already baffled as to why they felt the need to erase the Tak canon as it was, but they had to go and do it with this shitty show that obviously had no real creative vision behind it. It was apparently in development hell for the longest time, and it was probably a miracle that it even saw the light of day. So let's just move on and hope that the video games attached to this new Tak universe justifies its existence. First up in this modern era, as I'll be referring to it, we have 2008's Tak and the Guardians of Gross. And if this isn't the shortest section of this video, I will be thoroughly surprised. Guardians of Gross is so much of a nothing game, it was probably one of the toughest to get through. Not because it was that bad, it's just such a boring, repetitive snore fest that I struggled to sit back down and get through it. I mean, it only took me like 3 hours to get through, and most of that was dedicated to cutscenes. Speaking of, one day, modern Tak is walking through the forest complaining about how Jibulba asked him to go clean up the spoiled shrine. Jira and Kiko then show up and offer Tak a lift in the J-Runner. Oh, I failed to mention it in the previous section because it had no relevance, but in episode 10 Joyride, Jira is given a vehicle by the Jujus. It's basically just a car with hilariously oversized silly wheels. But anyway, Tak makes it to the spoiled shrine and starts cleaning. After a while, he gets too anxious and bored, so he does what Tak does best in this continuity and screws everything up. He gets the bright idea to lift this huge crystal into the air so he can put all of the trash underneath it, even though he could probably just as easily, I don't know, sweep the trash off the sides of the cliff? But surprise, surprise, he drops the crystal and releases the 4 gigantic G's. After meeting with Jibulba, Tak is tasked with finding each of the G's guardian Jujus. You find each of the guardians and they give you a special type of Juju magic that will help you defeat their respective gigantic G. Once each of the G's essences are collected back in Tak's staff, he returns to the spoiled shrine to set things right. Too bad he trips and sets them all free again. One of the guardians, Stinky Juju, tells of another way though. If he can collect their essence, drink it, and then burp, they will all be wiped from existence. So Tak does all of that and the day is saved. Game over. An ending somehow more anticlimactic than the Great Juju Challenge. Man, this story is such nothing. It really feels like something that could have just been an episode of the show, maybe a two-parter like Destiny Schmestiny if we're being generous. It just has that air about it where everything feels phoned in. Even the performances, while I might not love Hal Sparks as Tak, he wasn't what ruined the show. He was fine. But here, he just sounds like he's collecting a check and nothing more.
I use magic. It's easy. All I have to do is lift this giant crystal out of this hole with my staff, and then I can hide all the mess inside.
Same for literally every other voice too. For a Wii game, it's visually passable. I think the contrast is a little high by default. It kind of hurts my eyes to look at the screen in some areas, and I can't think of any other game that's ever done that to me. It was especially bad when using the attack button because the entire screen will flash every time Tak swings his staff, and it was very tough to continuously look at. The lip sync in these pre-rendered cutscenes is just as horrible as it is in the show, but that's probably because they got Nickelodeon to make them for them. And the in-game dialogue exchanges are just, I mean, look at them. They're not good. But okay, what is it that you do in this game, you're probably not asking? Well, let me just tell you, dear viewer, on this day, I was blessed with a Tak game that plays like an Uncharted game. Tak and the Guardians of Gross is a linear platformer with very light combat mechanics and a whole lot of minigames thrown in everywhere else. By holding down the Z button on the nunchuck, Tak will effortlessly vault over the terrain. He's also capable of running across long stretches of wall, running up walls to reach a higher ledge, shimmying across said ledges, jumping from wall to wall in tight spaces, and sliding down rails. It's entertaining to see these animations play out whenever you can string a bunch of them together. It's a nice visual treat. But the challenge in these areas are the same kind of challenge you would see in the first 3 Uncharted games. A bunch of ledges that have to be navigated in a very specific way, otherwise Tak falls and has to start over. I really think that this game can best be summed up as baby's first Uncharted game.
It's not what I'd call a staircase, but it'll do.
There are some sections towards the end of the game where there are some wall running chain jumps that have to be traversed, but that's the closest we get to difficult, I would say. There is the occasional branching path, but it's nothing special. Literally just another way to get across this ledge. I mean, I think the premise behind these climbing sections can be neat. So, like I mentioned, the gigantic G's are the meat of this game. Tak spends the majority of playtime climbing up each of them Shadow of the Colossus style. And it's kinda cool when you view the challenges in this lens. Traversing these titans' bodies to make it up to their face is novel. It doesn't change the fact that it's all extremely boring to play, but the idea is neat. The most entertaining aspect of these things, though, are their names. This one is literally named Trash Thulu. It almost feels like the Divine Beasts if I could compare it to something, because each of the Guardian Jujus gives Tak a specific type of magic before he gets sent there. The first one lets him move platforms that glow, the second one lets him roll on green surfaces, the third one lets him alternate blue and green objects like Mighty Switch Force, and the last one lets him blow a gust of wind. You don't keep them from level to level, so they all can't help but feel extremely gimmicky. And it also makes combat feel like more of an afterthought as well. Tak has 2 different attacks in this game, and I don't even think one of them works 100% of the time. If you hit the B button, Tak will swing his staff and hit the enemy. If you jump up in the air, he'll kinda shoot a laser or something at the ground. Sometimes it hurts enemies, and sometimes I don't know if it does. Combat is really boring. You'd think that those Juju spells would be a good way to spice things up, but I found one use for one of them. And it didn't even damage anything, it just kinda knocked them over. The beginning of the game tries to teach you that using the parkour button will cause Tak to vault over the enemies to defeat them more quickly, but I never really bothered with it. I used it to avoid enemy attacks, but they go down by spamming the attack just as fine. Some of the bigger enemies can be taken out instantly by using the parkour button if they're in a dizzied state. When enemies die, they drop these orbs that fill up Tak's super meter, and when it's full, he unleashes an attack that just wipes the screen, and that's all it does. I don't think I ever died to an enemy's attacks in the game. I'm actually not sure that Tak can die. I think he can just have his super meter lowered as a punishment for getting hit or falling off the level. So since there's no reason to defeat bad guys other than giving you the ability to skip any encounter you wish, I just ran past enemies if I didn't have to fight them. I think you unlock a harder difficulty when you beat the game called Challenge Mode, but I didn't play far enough into it to know. It seemed like the same exact campaign to me. There's also this multiplayer mode, but it's nothing that rivals even the Staff of Dreams dinky games. It just lets you play all of those little mini games that are the most simple things you could possibly throw together. There were some small gameplay instances with the Juju Rider, but they weren't anything to get excited about. An on-rail shooter and a driving game with horrible controls. The boss fights had some cool ideas here, but everything else going against the game drags them down. It's just really boring in every sense of the word. The story resolves itself in the dumbest way possible, the parkour is visually interesting but mechanically as shallow as Tak's personality, and you have one button to use to fight bad guys with. The most interesting thing about this game was when I was watching the credits and I saw Mike Bithel's name. Yeah, the same Mike Bithel who would later go on to create the incredibly popular Thomas Was Alone. But that's all really. Just thought that was neat. This section of the video was boring to write because this game is boring. Let's do the last one now, please. Released on the same exact day as Guardians of Gross, Tak and the Mojo Mistake is the final stop on our journey today. And seeing as how these two games share a release date, it's up in the air which is the actual Tak 4 and which is Tak 5. But seeing as how I've ordered them in this video, I think it's clear where I fall in the discussion. Well, honestly, this game's place on the Tak timeline is a little strange. For the first and last time ever, we have characters from both continuities in the same product. Discussions can be had with Kiko, Jira, Chief, Zarya, and the parents of those bullied kids, and Slog. All the characters from the modern era come pre-baked with their established personalities. And to my surprise, she returned. You can fully interact with flora and fauna in this game. Not gonna lie, it was kinda cool. But let's see how these characters are put to use in the story. On a nice day in the Pupanunu village, Tak is seen relaxing in a hammock, only for Locke to run past him while being chased by a wild boar. Shortly after, Tak is summoned by Jibulba to discuss a plan. Tak's first suggestion is to use magic, which gets shot down pretty quickly out of fear for the whole village getting turned into sheep. Oh, I get it, a little tongue-in-cheek reference to the first game? Okay, I see. But instead, Jibulba teaches Tak about the wonders of alchemy. And don't worry, it's nothing like what you might immediately think of when you first hear that word. Tak prepares to go find the ingredients Jibulba needs to get rid of the boar, but the whole village basically stops him with their own problems. Everyone wants something different, and all at the same time. So errand boy Tak starts tackling everyone's problems one by one. This eventually leads him to the Juju Bazaar, and wouldn't you know, the Jujus then pile up around Tak and start asking him to run errands for them. Tak then goes back to the village for some reason and exclaims he's forgotten one of the ingredients, bristleberries. But he says, oh well, thistleberries will do just fine, and begins the concoction anyway. And he ends up making this little pins and needles knockoff, and the reasoning for this really wasn't mentioned or alluded to, so don't feel like you're missing something. You're not. He then goes off to find Juju berries, which is the last ingredient Jibulba needs to stop the boar, which goes off without a hitch. So well, in fact, that Jibulba tells Tak that he has more responsibilities for him. Tak says he's sick of helping people though, and wants to make another helper to make these things go by quicker. So apparently that thing is called a helper, and I think the game is trying to tell me that it was the one who was gathering those ingredients in the missions. I have no idea why though, because every time I walk by the thing, it's just standing there in Jibulba's hut. But okay, yeah, let's just make more of them, Tak. I'm sure that'll go over really well. Wow, that must be a new record for how quickly one of Tak's spells has backfired horribly. He follows some of the crazed helpers to the Juju Bazaar and sees that they're wreaking havoc there. The Jujus inform Tak that if he doesn't take care of this matter soon, they'll have to destroy the entire village, which is probably the most drastic the Jujus have ever been, but alright. Tak tracks the very last crazed helper to the volcano and takes him out, but all this does is corrupt the helpers further for some reason. So Tak has to go around taking the new enemies out and collecting more ingredients for a new spell. And after doing so and gathering at the village, Jibulba casts the spell, but it creates an abomination because Tak forgot the bristleberries again.
Idiots!
So after Tak beats this thing in a one-on-one fight, the original helper offers up its bristleberries so the spell can complete. With the bristleberries in hand, Tak casts the spell and gets rid of the giant mutated helper once and for all. But hold up, let's rewind for just a second here. How did the helper give Tak bristleberries at the end of the game when it was very clear that the events of the game were kicked off because Tak didn't have bristleberries to make the original helper? He had to substitute them with thistleberries. So the entire plot doesn't make sense when you stop and read the handful of cutscenes it presents you with. Oh well, who really cares? Tak becomes depressed after peace is returned to the land, only for Jibulba to reveal that he revived and repaired the original helper, closing the game out with a shot of the two of them relaxing in hammocks, mirroring the opening shot. But now, Tak has a friend. Kiko and Jira notwithstanding. It's a story that caves in on itself at an exponential rate when you start to even mildly examine it. The story makes no sense by the logic that it itself sets up. But I'm going to give this story points for two things in particular. Firstly, I will be forever grateful for giving me one final chance to interact with my darling Flora. And secondly, I really like how the threat of this game wasn't to Laylock or Travis. I do miss the days when Tak didn't have to be the cause for literally every problem we witness, and I'm especially mad that he didn't even really learn a lesson at the end of this game, but I do think the helpers are cool as threats, so it gets a pass. Hey man, what's that over there? What, you mean that lazy transition? We have ourselves a mission-based 2D platformer. There are 4 different sprawling levels to explore, and the quest you accept from the quest board determines where your goal will be in said level. These things are huge though. There are multiple areas that could probably be their own levels in any other game, but they're all smushed together here to create these gargantuan play areas. For example, the jungle level features an initial stretch of linear level, but it eventually leads you to a waterfall. From here you can continue down the waterfall and get to this portion of the level, or use the hidden switch halfway down the waterfall to access this hill area. From the hill area, you can continue to go deeper into the jungle, or you can find your way up to this ice cave which goes deeper into the mountain. All of the 4 levels are built just like this in regards to complexity, and to a certain extent, it's kind of cool learning these huge levels and remembering the layouts as I revisit them each time. But you know what's not cool? Mostly everything else about them. For me, this game's biggest issue is its mission structure. So it doesn't matter where the objective is for any particular quest, Tak will begin at the same exact starting point for each of the 4 levels. Is the objective just a few screens over? That's a bet, you start at the beginning. Is the objective all the way at the furthest possible screen from the beginning? That's a bet too, start from the beginning though. There's a blockade in the beginning section of a level. You have to fulfill the prerequisites each time you go to the level. Any animals that you have to get past, you've got to get through them in the exact same way every single time. Get this barrel off this ledge, get specifically 3 drops of honey, and then throw it in front of this bear. Get this skunk to spray you so you can scare the acorn throwing squirrel away. Repeating these tasks isn't difficult in the slightest, it's just obnoxious. This wouldn't be the end of the world if you had some sort of feature that would, I don't know, guide you to the current objective so you don't have to waste time with unnecessary level choke points. Off the top of my head, a basic map would probably solve a lot of the issues these missions have. There is this indicator that Tak has on the bottom of the screen. The majority of the time it'll be this blue color, and when Tak enters the screen before the screen the objective is in, it'll turn yellow. And when he enters the screen the objective is in, it'll turn this bright pink color. It works pretty well for quests that are only tracking one objective, but later on there will be quests that require Tak to find multiple of one thing. Whether that be an item or an enemy type, this tracker is now useless. It no longer goes off for any of these objectives, so missions like these give me serious Shadow the Hedgehog flashbacks. I spent over half an hour on more than few of these missions because it's really easy to overlook or miss items on the ground. Even locating multiple enemies in a single level is tough. There were so many occasions where I would have to start making laps around the level, trying every hole, crevice, and secret area just to see if I could locate the last of these things. A lot of these headaches could have been alleviated by such simple solutions. I don't know how one of them didn't make it into the game. Obviously, a map would be the biggest help. Maybe give us a radar that works like it's supposed to all of the time instead of sometimes. I'd take the fucking Sonic Adventure 2 Emerald radar at this point, dude. A Super Mario Sunshine approach could even help with the blocking off of any unnecessary chunks of the level, but then that would bump into the biggest argument for exploration as it stands, and that's the new alchemy system. This game's biggest addition is the alchemy system. Tak will find so many items and ingredients as he goes along on his adventure. These ingredients can be used to do several things. In the field, he can use ingredients to cast magic like a blast of fire, raining icicles, damaging vines coming up from the ground, but more useful than any of those, healing. Ingredients are used for more than just heat of the moment offensive spells though. When back at the village, Tak can combine ingredients together to make a number of different things that augment his abilities and attributes. Taking some cues from the Great Juju Challenge DS, Tak can equip blessing gems to do things like increase maximum defense, health, mana, and attack power. So check this out, these stat altering gems are all circular. Meanwhile, there are diamond shaped gems which give Tak more interesting abilities. My favorite was the one that gave him back his short glide from Staff of Dreams in Great Juju Challenge. I got a lot of use out of that one. There are more superfluous gems that I didn't bother with, like being able to dive underwater or walking on lava without taking damage. These are nice and will allow Tak to find more hard to come by ingredients easily, but it often requires that the player grind to collect duplicates of these ingredients. This will be the thing that makes or breaks this game for you. If you're the type of player that loves to have the most incredible weapons and abilities in the game, Mojo Mistake gives you plenty of options to make an all-powerful Tak, but the way in which you have to do this is grind ingredients in these missions. Rare items will be kept at the end of optional routes and missions that will make you go far out of your way, or they might even be the reward for a difficult optional mission. Here's an example. I wanted to upgrade my new weapon, but to do so, I needed these oakbeard mosses and an oakbeard branch. Turns out the Oakbeard is an optional boss, so I go through the whole mission and beat him, and I got plenty of Oakbeard moss, but not a single Oakbeard branch. So I assume that the branch is just a really rare drop from Oakbeard, and to get it you just have to grind that boss fight. And guys, if you know me, you know I am so not the kind of player to do that. Grinding is not my cup of tea at all. Check the Dragon Quest XI video if you need more clarification. And on top of the mission structure and the need for grinding to give Tak abilities worth a damn, the combat you're doing all this for is just kinda there. Combat is a big ol' missed opportunity. Tak's combos are dictated by the weapon he has, so he starts off with this 3-hit combo and this little wind projectile. I stuck with the same weapon but upgraded it a few times as I played. This added some attacks to that combo as well as making the projectile stronger. I made a club with stronger attack power later on but lost the projectile move, so I swapped back pretty quickly. Because combat isn't something that has the potential to have effort placed into it. Optimal play looks a lot like this, getting one combo off and then running backwards a little bit so their attack can't hit you just to run back for another combo. It's serviceable, but that's it. A block or dedicated dodge button goes a long way to making combat like this more engaging, and any enemy that's not humongous or a boss can be comboed to death very easily. Even the mutated helpers can be put into this infinite loop thanks to Tak being able to throw a quick aerial hit after his slam attack. Those magic attacks you can use ingredients to cast are great at dealing damage, but there are a few reasons I don't really keep them in mind. They're really unwieldy to cast, first of all. In the heat of a fight, they want you to go to the ingredients menu, have the 2 ingredients needed memorized, put them in the slots, navigate to the alchemy tab, and then mix them together. This is all done by the touchscreen, mind you, and you're still supposed to be attacking, moving, and dodging at the same time. Then, who's to say you find the ingredients you need to cast your favorite spell in any given mission? And if this is the case, like it normally is, you'll be stocking your inventory full of these items before you leave for the quest. This is a problem because of how limited the inventory is. You will frequently be running out of space and discarding items in the middle of these quests. Plus, you'll likely need to keep those ingredients necessary for healing spells as well as the ones that conjure powerful attacks. The system is just way more cumbersome than it's worth, and I explain all these powerful maneuvers like they make a difference, but it's unlikely any enemy will give you a run for your money in this game. What will end up killing you is the damage you'll accumulate from taking cheap shots. Most of the enemies can be avoided rather easily, and you better believe that most of them were just ignored. It's very easy to jump past almost all of them, but because these levels are so long, and so many of the objectives have you wandering around aimlessly, the damage will start to pile up. And a lot of these enemies are really good about getting cheap shots on you. The Shaman Woodies have their projectile that follows you, these rock guys have this block that they can use to distract you while their buddy comes in for a rolling attack, and then these little rock guys just charge forward so fast that you can barely react. It all just adds up to combat not feeling like a test of skill, but rather a test of being prepared. Because if you don't have several ingredients that can heal Tak, you aren't going to last long in some of the later missions, such as the plethora of missions where the touchscreen gets put to use in the Juju realm. I gotta be real with you, these made me want to f***ing scream. There are the ones that make you swipe up and down on the screen to change the gravity while also using the D-pad to maneuver Tak. Those aren't the end of the world, to be honest, but they weren't fun. There are also these that have you manipulate the wind, drawing circles in the direction you want the wind to whip towards. You still move Tak left and right with the D-pad, but for him to jump, you have to flick the ground beneath him. It's not a binary kind of jump either. The faster you flick, the higher he goes, and I swear sometimes it just wasn't working. There are also these invisible enemies running around, and the only way to kill them is to flick a giant boulder on top of them. They can be stunned by flicking them directly, but that doesn't last long. And in these, Tak starts floating, and you have to flick the stylus in the direction you want him to travel. These made me lose my marbles just a little bit. Because again, the speed and direction is very precise with where you flick. Plus he needs to be maneuvered through these crushing walls. Thank God, they aren't instant kills because I might have given up. There are invisible things all over the place that bounce him back, and I am not exaggerating when I say this was one of the most infuriating things I've gone through for this video. The touchscreen segments came to a fever pitch when I had to fight boss fights with each control scheme. If you've noticed throughout the footage, the only enemies in these levels are the invisible digging enemies on the wind stage, and for good reason. The control is the real enemy here, and Tak can only drop explosive barrels as a means of attacking. The ceiling swapping fight was fine, if a bit jank because of the whole barrel attack thing. The floating one was ridiculous because I had no idea what was happening. I just kept ramming into him over and over until I won. And the wind current one was awful. The helpers were invisible, so I had to drop barrels on the spots where I thought they were, and they had these super damaging attacks that had to be jumped over, but guess what? I had to use the stupid touchscreen to jump over the simplest of obstacles. It was not fun, plain and simple. There are several things that just blatantly hold this game back really badly, but again, it's not a complete disaster. I didn't totally hate this game, and as a fan of the original games, how could I? This game feels like a genuine bridge between the two eras of the franchise. Getting to interact with the animals from the original trilogy the same ways that I would in those games was surprisingly nostalgic. Being able to collect Yorbles one last time was great, and seeing some of my favorite characters from the previous games while also having the newly expanded Poopanunu tribe was great. Being able to craft the Staff of Dreams in this game, I mean, how cool is that? But all of the little neat items require so many rare ingredients that I'd have to grind for, and I'm not about to spend any more time on this game than I have to. If I had gotten this game when I was a kid though, I would have been all over something like that. I would have loved replaying missions and beating all these secret bosses to get cool items and stuff, but in the present day, I am not about that grind. And that grind was definitely part of the intended gameplay loop. You can make a blessing gem that increases the drop rate of rare items, and that kind of stuff just says it all to me. As it stands, Mojo Mistake is a pretty decent platformer with good replay value when you look at it from afar. But when you take a closer look, you see that it's bloated by its own mission structure and the need to give the player room to gather these ingredients to make the secret weapons they desire, while also featuring some phenomenally frustrating displays of ham-fisted touchscreen use. The story and characters might be a breath of fresh air, but this one overpoured on a few things when mixing in the alchemy pot. Alrighty, that was the last time that Tak took the leading role in anything. There are the Nicktoons games that feature Tak and Laylock as playable characters, but those aren't Tak games, so I don't think I'll be playing through them. While I don't think that any of these games are 10 out of 10 masterpieces, I do think that a few display some really fun ideas and creativity. So now that we have them all under our belt, I think it'd be a fun idea to see where everything falls in a tier list to cap it all off. Alright, so let's just go one by one and throw them in there. Tak 1 for the Gamecube is definitely a good game. It could totally be nostalgia, but I really think this is the best the series ever was. As for the GBA version, it's just got so many issues that make it a bad time to run through. Even a casual playthrough isn't worth it. Thus securing this game a spot in the I would hit my parents if they bought me this category. Tak 2 for the Gamecube. It's not a bad game, but it has a lot of things that frustrated me. It played it very fast and loose with how it was structured, dropping mechanics for the sake of keeping things fresh, but rarely ever fleshing anything out. It also largely dropped the exploratory elements from the first game, so I'd say it earns its spot in the not great but well-meaning category. Tak 2 for the GBA is pretty poopy. The whole mana system was just so busted. I really can't explain how tedious it was to have to go back and forth between those pots of mana juice just to progress the game. And on top of that, the combat was one-sided and the levels had a tendency to be frustrating. Sorry, but this one is a bad game. Tak and the Great Juju Challenge for the Gamecube surprised me going back. It could have been the fact that I was lucky enough to play through the whole thing with my best friend, but I had a great time. The cooperation was really interesting, Tak and Locke gained some fun abilities throughout, the cutscenes are really entertaining.
Tak, I never knew you were cool. I think we just bonded. Do you want a hug?
No.
Me neither, so quit asking me.
I just really hope this game can find its way onto the Nintendo Switch someday. Good game. Great Juju Challenge for the GBA though, not quite. The same pitfalls that plague the other GBA games are still prevalent here. Not as badly, mind you, but not good either. It's a more functionally sound game, yeah, but there are still so many instances of jank level design, and the game around it isn't really interesting enough to justify a playthrough. Not great, but well-meaning. But Great Juju Challenge DS? What a surprise! This game had me worried to begin with, but I ended up loving the game way more than I thought I would. The minigames weren't the best, but they also weren't super intrusive. The main thing that surprised me though was that combat. It was so crunchy and way more flexible than anything we've seen in this franchise. I dare to say that it is the best combat system this franchise has ever seen, and for that, this is a good game. The Tak television show. What do I even say? They just missed the point of what made the characters good in this new continuity. Tak is such a selfish brat, and that's not what he's supposed to be to me. The jokes are all dreadfully unfunny, and it's the ugliest product to come out of this franchise by far. But worse than any of that, it's just boring as hell. Tak and the Guardians of Gross is in a similar boat. We never really listen to any of the villagers talk, so there's no annoying back and forth between them, but Tak gives us plenty of that throughout the levels.
Gorgonzilla, prepare to be toasted!
And the combat is so imprecise and boring. Again, it's just boring as hell. And finally, we have Tak and the Mojo Mistake. It has a lot of great ideas like the alchemy and the crafting of the new weapons to get better combos, but the structure of those missions are just, whew. A handheld game especially shouldn't be that exhausting to play and get through. Those missions would take me close to 30 minutes just to find a small little secret at the back corner of the level. The story wasn't terrible, even if it did perpetuate the whole Tak is a lonely, selfish brat that tries to solve all of his problems with magic and it always backfires stereotype that I hate. It just feels like it could have really benefited from some extra time to iron out those kinks. And for that reason, I would say it's not great, but well-meaning. And finally, the last thing we have to look at
is Flora, so give it up for her. Gosh, she's so perfect in every conceivable way. Why won't you marry me, Flora?
There you have it. Everything is wrapped up in a neat and tidy little list. I really hope you enjoyed this trip through a long-forgotten franchise like Tak and the Power of Juju. The franchise is unlikely to see a resurgence today with Avalanche onto bigger and better things like Hogwarts Legacy. The original team that was responsible for Tak likely aren't even employed by Avalanche anymore. I would personally love to see a true Tak 4 at some point, or a remaster for the original trilogy on modern hardware. Hell, I'd be satisfied with a playable appearance of Tak in Nickelodeon All-Stars Brawl, but I wouldn't hold your breath for any of that. The only thing with this brand's name on it today is the show, which is currently streaming on Paramount+. This was all a really nice trip down memory lane, and weirdly brought some closure to these boxes sitting on my shelf. And I hope I was able to give you something similar with this massive video. And speaking of you, I really want to extend my sincerest thanks if you happen to make it to the end of this thing. This project took me about half a year of on and off again work to do. I played through every game and I watched the entirety of the show on my own. I love doing these huge videos, but they undeniably take a toll on me. But seeing you guys share the video around and comment with your own personal experiences makes it all worthwhile. If you care to, I would love suggestions for what series will get this treatment next time, so feel free to leave that in the comment section below. And if you want to see more of me, make sure you do all the YouTube stuff like go subscribe and check out the rest of the channel. I have plenty of content and I talk a little bit about everything, so I'm sure you can find another video on this channel that interests you somewhere. Also, feel free to check the description for links to our Twitter accounts and our new TikTok account. But yeah, it feels weird to end a video that's gone on this long, but it is finally over. Again, I appreciate you so much for watching. So thanks for stopping by, and have a great day.